The hike had been going well. It was one of those cool mornings in late October, the air crisp, and a soft fog still hanging in the woods as I made my way up the trail. The leaves underfoot were a mix of yellow and orange, a clear sign that fall was in full swing. I had taken the weekend off to get away from everything, away from the city, the noise, the stress. The forest was the perfect place to clear my head. I had spent years hiking in the woods, so I knew the area pretty well, or at least I thought I did. It was a little over an hour into my hike when I first noticed something was off. The quiet felt too still, almost too perfect. The usual sounds of birds and rustling animals were missing. It wasn't complete silence, but it was close, unnaturally close. I stopped for a moment, checking my watch. It was 9:45 a.m. The sun was up, but the fog still hadn't lifted. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just the usual fog that lingered in this part of the forest. Still, a sense of unease settled in my chest, but I continued walking, telling myself it was nothing. The trail narrowed as I moved further into the woods, and I had to step carefully over rocks and fallen branches. The woods here were dense, thick with pines and the occasional oak. The trail wasn't a well-trodden one, but it was clearly marked with yellow paint on the trees, so it wasn't easy to get lost. I had done this hike multiple times before, so I didn't feel any real fear. Still, there was this strange feeling that I couldn't shake, like I was being watched. I pushed on, convincing myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The fog began to clear a little as I reached a small clearing where I planned to take a break. I sat on a large rock, pulling out my water bottle and a protein bar. My phone, of course, had no signal, which didn't bother me much. I wasn't here for a connection to the world, just for the peace and quiet. As I sat there, eating and taking in the stillness of the woods, I couldn't help but feel like the air was thick, heavier than usual. It felt like something was pressing down on me, a weight that I couldn't escape. I stood up quickly, brushing the dirt off my pants, and glanced around. That's when I saw it. First, I thought it was a deer. I had seen plenty of wildlife in these woods before, but this figure was too still and its posture was off. It was crouched behind a cluster of bushes, just barely visible. The figure was tall, taller than any deer I had ever seen. Its body hunched almost too much so. I froze, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The creature's head turned slightly, just enough that I could see its face. But it wasn't a face, not like any face I had ever seen. Its eyes were too wide, too black, and its skin was stretched tight over its bones, as though it didn't belong to any animal I recognized. I slowly backed away, not taking my eyes off the thing. My breath hitched in my throat, and my heart began to race. The figure didn't move at first, stayed crouched, watching me with those black eyes. I could feel the blood pounding in my ears. I had no idea what it was, but I knew I had to get away. I turned and started to walk backward, slowly at first, then quicker as panic set in. The air felt even heavier now, as though the forest itself was pressing in on me, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. That's when I heard it, the crunch of leaves behind me. My heart stopped. The figure had moved. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just trees, just the fog. I blinked hard, trying to make sense of what was happening. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was some trick of the fog or the light. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I started to walk faster, keeping my eyes peeled for any movement in the trees. The sense of being watched grew stronger with every step I took. The silence was oppressive now, the stillness almost unbearable. The path was more difficult to follow as I tried to move faster. My steps hurried but careful. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure standing behind me, but nothing. The forest seemed empty, silent, but it wasn't right. It didn't feel right. I heard the crunch of leaves again, but this time it was closer, too close. I whipped my head around and saw a shadow dart between two trees, too fast for my mind to fully process. I froze, my breath shallow, my body trembling. I knew I wasn't alone, but it felt like the woods had come alive around me. I started walking again, quicker this time, but still as quietly as I could manage. The path was growing more difficult to navigate, branches scratching at my arms, roots trying to trip me. I wasn't sure if it was the fear or the fog, but I couldn't get my bearings anymore. Everything seemed off. I reached another clearing, but this one felt different, almost wrong. The air was thick, heavy, like the world itself was holding its breath. There were no birds, no wind, no sound, just the quiet. I stood there, trying to listen for anything, but there was nothing. And then I saw it again, the figure. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, just watching me. This time, it was more visible, and I could see its features more clearly. It was tall, hunched, its skin stretched tight over its body. Its face, it was like nothing human, and yet it almost looked human. The eyes were too big, too black, and there was a strange, almost unnatural stillness to its presence. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I wasn't supposed to be here. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. I turned to run, but something stopped me. A voice, no, not a voice, more like a thought, an instinct told me to look back, and so I did. The figure was no longer standing at the edge of the clearing. It was right behind me. I didn't think, I just ran. I sprinted through the forest, my legs burning, my lungs on fire, but I didn't stop, couldn't. Behind me, the sound of something following, moving with unnatural speed, grew louder. The brush crackled, branches snapped. I couldn't tell if it was the thing from before or something else. My mind was foggy with fear, but I kept running. My only thought was to get out of the woods, to get somewhere, anywhere that felt safe. The trail began to widen as I neared the edge of the forest, and I saw the light filtering through the trees ahead. I wasn't far from the parking lot now, I realized. My chest heaved as I burst into the open, not daring to look back. The sound of pursuit faded, but I didn't slow down. I didn't stop until I was back at my car, the engine running before I even fully sat down. I slammed the door shut, my hands shaking. I looked around, half expecting to see the figure in the trees, but there was nothing. The parking lot was empty, silent. The woods, though, those woods felt different now, darker. I couldn't explain what had happened, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. All I knew was that I had seen something I shouldn't have, something that didn't belong. As I drove away, the fog still clung to the trees behind me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been out there was still watching, still waiting. I decided to take a hike alone that Saturday morning. I had been working nonstop for weeks, and the idea of a solo trek through the dense woods was exactly what I needed to clear my head. It was early fall 2024, and I was 31 years old. My name is Jason, and I lived in a small town in the northeastern United States. The weather was mild, the sun peeking out from behind scattered clouds, perfect for a hike. I was looking forward to getting out of town and away from the usual noise. The trail I chose wasn't too far from where I lived, about a 40-minute drive up into the mountains. It was a popular spot for hikers, but it wasn't heavily trafficked either. People came for the views, the tranquility. That's what I was after, too. I parked my truck at the trailhead, grabbed my backpack, and started walking. The first mile was easy. The trail was well marked, lined with tall trees whose leaves were just beginning to change color. The ground was soft underfoot, covered with a mix of dirt and fallen leaves. Birds were chirping overhead, and the occasional rustle of animals in the brush reminded me that I wasn't completely alone. But the solitude was what I craved, so I pushed on. As I moved deeper into the woods, the trail narrowed. The trees grew closer together, casting long shadows even though it was still morning. I wasn't concerned. I had hiked here a few times before and knew my way around. It wasn't a difficult path, just a few twists and turns, with a steady incline leading to a small, secluded lake. After a while, the sounds of wildlife became less frequent, replaced by the sound of my boots crunching on the dirt. The air felt cooler now, almost damp. I stopped for a moment to catch my breath, wiping the sweat from my brow. I didn't see anyone else on the trail so far, which wasn't unusual, but it still felt oddly quiet. Almost too quiet. I took a swig from my water bottle and resumed walking, the feeling of being watched creeping into the back of my mind. It wasn't anything specific, just an instinctual awareness, a feeling of something off. I pushed the thought aside, focusing on the path ahead. The trail bent sharply to the left, and as I rounded the corner, I spotted him. At first, I didn't quite register who or what he was. He stood about 20 yards away, halfway up a small rise in the trail, just beyond a cluster of trees. His back was to me. He was tall, dressed in dark, weathered clothes. His hat, too big for his head, was pulled low, casting his face in shadow. For a split second, I thought he might be another hiker like me, just taking a rest or enjoying the view. But something didn't sit right. The way he stood so still, as if he hadn't moved in a while, was unsettling. I couldn't see his face clearly, but his posture was odd. His shoulders were hunched, and his body language just felt off. It was as if he didn't belong there. I called out a simple "hey," not wanting to seem rude but unsure of how to approach him. No response. He didn't move an inch. I tried again, louder this time, but he still didn't react. I felt my pulse quicken. Normally, people on these trails acknowledge each other, even if it's just a wave or a nod. But this guy wasn't acting normal. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My instinct screamed at me to turn around and leave, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. I'd had plenty of solo hikes before, and I'd never had a bad experience. The thought that something could be wrong was in the back of my mind, but I tried to push it down. I started walking again, keeping an eye on the figure ahead. He was still standing there, motionless. The more I looked at him, the more wrong it seemed. I couldn't explain it, but the way he didn't respond to my voice or move at all was unnerving. I was close enough now that I could see the weathered appearance of his clothes. They were old, dirt-streaked, and mismatched, not at all like something someone would wear for a hike. And his boots, they were scuffed, old, and seemed to have been through far more than just a few trails. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was just a loner, someone who liked the silence of the woods. Maybe he didn't hear me, but the longer I watched him, the more unsettled I became. There was something about him that didn't fit. And as I stood there, trying to decide what to do, I noticed something else. He wasn't alone. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a second figure. Another man. He appeared suddenly, almost like he had been hiding behind a tree, though I didn't hear him approach. He was dressed similarly, dark, tattered clothes and a large hat, but he was much closer now. This man stood off to the side of the first, his face hidden as well. Panic flared in my chest. I wasn't just seeing one strange man. There were two, and neither of them had acknowledged me. Felt as though they were waiting for something, waiting for me. I knew then I had to leave. I turned quickly, my heart pounding, and started walking briskly down the trail. My mind raced as I moved, thoughts swirling. The sense of danger was unmistakable. These men weren't hikers. They weren't even behaving like people I'd encounter in the woods. I didn't know who they were or what they wanted, but I knew I had to get out of there before they decided to make a move. The path behind me was still eerily silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were following me. I glanced over my shoulder, but I didn't see them. I pushed on, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread that gnawed at my gut. The trees blurred past me, the winding trail seeming to stretch longer with every step. I didn't know if I was being followed. I didn't hear footsteps or see shadows moving behind me, but I still couldn't shake the feeling. I quickened my pace, my breath coming faster. The trees were thick now, and I knew I was getting closer to the lake, my destination. When I finally reached the lake, I stopped for a moment to catch my breath. The water was still, the surface reflecting the sky above. It was peaceful here, the kind of quiet I had been looking for when I set out on this hike. But the sense of unease still lingered in my chest. I took a seat on a nearby rock, trying to calm myself. The two men had not appeared on the trail behind me, but I kept looking over my shoulder. I had no idea where they'd gone or what their intentions were, but I couldn't shake the thought that they were still out there, watching. I stayed by the lake for a while, trying to steady my nerves. The silence of the place seemed oppressive now, and every movement in the trees seemed like a threat. But nothing happened. No footsteps. No sign of them. When I finally made the decision to head back, I was careful. I retraced my steps slowly, listening intently for any sound of movement behind me. There was nothing, not even the usual sounds of wildlife, just the rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. As I neared the point where I had first seen the two men, I took a deep breath, expecting the worst. But when I reached that spot, I saw no sign of them. There were no footprints in the dirt, no broken branches, nothing that would indicate anyone had been there. I couldn't explain it. I didn't know what had happened or who those men were. It wasn't until I got back to my truck and drove down the mountain that I felt like I could breathe again. I don't know what I saw that day, but it wasn't normal. I haven't gone back to that trail since, and I'm not sure I ever will. I remember the day I decided to go hiking like it was yesterday. The sun was just starting to peek over the horizon as I pulled up to the trailhead. It was the kind of morning that hinted at something special, a crispness in the air that made it perfect for a long walk in the woods. I had been looking forward to this for weeks, needing to clear my mind and find some solitude. The hike was supposed to be a simple one. It was a trail I had heard about from a friend who had done it before. He told me it wasn't particularly difficult, just a good trail to get away from the hustle and bustle of daily life. It started at a small parking lot off a quiet, dirt road in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in Tennessee. I had my gear, my water, a map, and the feeling that I was about to experience something calm and peaceful. I wasn't new to hiking, but I was still somewhat cautious. I had a tendency to worry about what could go wrong. My backpack felt a little too heavy, but I figured that was just my mind playing tricks on me. I had all the essentials: snacks, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and a small knife just in case. The hike was supposed to be a day trip, so I wasn't worried about running out of supplies or being caught off guard by anything. The first part of the trail was relatively flat, following the banks of a small creek. The sound of running water was soothing, and the dense trees above created a canopy that kept the sun from fully breaking through. It was quiet, but not unsettling. Birds chirped in the distance, and the rustling of leaves beneath my boots was the only sound I could hear. The trail was narrow and winding, but it was easy to follow, with bright orange markers on the trees that showed the way. As I made my way deeper into the woods, the trail began to climb. The path became steeper, and I had to pay more attention to where I was stepping. I could feel my muscles working harder, but it felt good. I liked the challenge. The air was getting cooler as I ascended, and the woods seemed to grow quieter. The further I went, the more the sounds of the outside world seemed to fade away, replaced by the sound of my own breathing and the occasional snap of a twig beneath my boots. The trees here were taller, their thick trunks rising high above me, and the forest floor was soft with a carpet of fallen pine needles and moss. There was something almost magical about it. This feeling of being alone in a vast, ancient place. I paused for a moment, taking a deep breath and looking around. The sun had fully risen now, and the forest was alive with light and color. But there was also something else, something subtle in the air. A shift in the atmosphere that I couldn't quite place. I shrugged it off, convincing myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I was being paranoid. I was out here on my own for the first time in a while, so maybe the solitude was getting to me a little. I checked my watch. It had only been about an hour since I started the hike. I still had a ways to go before I reached the summit. But then something caught my eye. It wasn't anything big or dramatic, just a small movement in the corner of my vision. At first, I thought it was just a squirrel or a deer, but when I looked closer, I saw that there was someone else on the trail. The figure was standing about 100 feet away, just beyond the next bend in the path. They were facing away from me, so I couldn't see their face, but the way they stood was strange. Almost too still, like they were waiting for something. I felt a tightness in my chest, a sudden sense of unease creeping in. I didn't know why, but something about that figure felt wrong. It wasn't just the fact that I hadn't seen anyone on the trail up until that point. It was the way they stood there, motionless. I hesitated, wondering if I should keep going or wait to see if they moved. I decided to push forward. I wasn't going to let my nerves get the best of me. But as I took a few more steps, something made me stop. I could hear the sound of footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate, like someone was following me. My heart skipped a beat. I turned around quickly, but there was no one there. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. Maybe it was the wind, or just the forest playing tricks on me. It wasn't like I was in immediate danger. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I quickened my pace, trying to push the unease from my mind. But as I rounded the next bend, I saw that the figure was still there, just standing motionless in the middle of the trail. Now they were closer, and I could see more clearly that they were wearing a large, dark jacket and a wide-brimmed hat. It was an odd choice of clothing for a hike, but maybe they had their reasons. I paused again, wondering what I should do. I didn't want to be rude, but I wasn't sure if I wanted to get any closer. The figure remained silent, unmoving, like they didn't even know I was there. I could feel the tension building in my chest. There was a strange, almost oppressive silence in the air now. The usual sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the distant calls of birds were gone. It was as if everything had stopped, holding its breath. Finally, I took a step forward, clearing my throat to let the person know I was coming up behind them. But just as I did, they moved. Slowly, deliberately, they turned their head toward me. At that moment, I froze. The figure's face was obscured by the shadow of their hat, but I could see enough to know that something was off. Their skin was unnaturally pale, almost ghostly. Their eyes, when they finally met mine, were dark, too dark, and there was something about them that made my stomach turn. There was no warmth, no recognition, just an eerie emptiness that sent a chill running through me. The figure took a single step toward me, and that was enough to make me panic. I didn't even think. I just turned and started running. I wasn't sure if I was being paranoid or if something really was wrong, but I didn't want to take any chances. The sound of my own footsteps echoed in the silence as I pushed myself harder, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop to look back, but I could feel the weight of the figure's presence just behind me. Every time I thought I might have gained some distance, I heard the faint sound of footsteps following me, matching my pace. It felt like hours, but it was probably only minutes before I saw the sign for the trail's halfway point. I made it to the clearing near the creek and could hear the sound of water flowing once again. The peaceful rush of the stream was a welcome contrast to the dread that had built up in my mind. I stumbled to a stop, panting for breath, looking around. There was no one in sight, no figure, no footsteps. I told myself that I had overreacted. Maybe it had all been in my head, the isolation, the quiet, the strange way my mind had been playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My hands were shaking as I dug through my backpack for my phone. I had no signal, but it made me feel safer to have it in my hand. I debated turning back. Maybe I should just call it a day, head back to my car and go home. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't leave. I couldn't let whatever it was, whatever I had felt, take that control from me. I took a deep breath and forced myself to move forward. I wasn't going to let fear dictate my every step. And as I made my way down the trail, slowly at first, my confidence returned. There was no one behind me, no strange figure, no footsteps in the distance. Just the sounds of the forest, the birds, the breeze in the trees. By the time I reached the parking lot, I was exhausted but relieved. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the trail. As I opened the door to my car, I felt a strange sense of closure, as if I had left something behind in the woods. And maybe I had. Maybe the forest had reminded me that sometimes the scariest things aren't the ones we can see, but the ones we can't. It wasn't the figure that had haunted me. It was the fear of being alone, of being vulnerable in a place where the rules of the world seemed to disappear. But I made it out, and as I drove home, the sun setting behind me, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back to that trail. Not anytime soon, anyway. It was the kind of trip I had been planning for months. A solo hike through the mountains of the Pacific Northwest. The idea had always intrigued me. Getting away from the noise of everyday life, stepping into nature, and testing my limits. But as I loaded up my backpack with supplies, I had a strange feeling in the pit of my stomach. Something about the hike felt off, but I shook it off. I'd been on enough trails to know the drill. Nothing to worry about. I started the hike early in the morning, just as the sun began to rise, casting soft pink and orange hues across the sky. The cool morning air made my breath visible as I began the trek up a rugged, uneven trail that snaked up the side of Mount Harlan. It was a well-known trail, so I knew it wouldn't be too remote. But something about the way the fog hung low over the trees that morning felt a little eerie. I figured I'd just take it slow, pace myself, and enjoy the silence. The first few hours were peaceful. The only sounds I could hear were the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the occasional rustling of leaves as I brushed past low-hanging branches. The trail, though challenging, was manageable. Steep inclines, sharp turns, and thick woods with old-growth trees, their massive trunks rising like silent giants, towering above me. Every now and then, I'd stop to take in the view. The dense forest stretched endlessly in all directions, with only the distant peaks of the mountain range peeking through the clouds. I'd been hiking for a good 5 hours when the weather started to change. The sun disappeared behind a thick blanket of clouds, and the wind picked up, carrying with it the smell of damp earth. I glanced at my watch. It was just past noon, but the light was dimming as if it were much later in the day. The temperature dropped quickly, and I pulled my jacket tighter around my shoulders, trying to ignore the feeling of unease that had started to creep in. I knew I was about 2/3 of the way up when I reached a fork in the trail. To the left, the path seemed to wind deeper into the forest, disappearing into a thicket of trees. To the right, the trail hugged the mountainside, giving way to an expansive view of the valley below. I debated for a moment, but the weather had grown colder, and I didn't want to risk getting lost in dense woods. So I turned right, following the narrow trail along the cliff's edge. The further I went, the colder it got. The wind howled through the trees, sending gusts of cold air cutting through my jacket, and the fog began to thicken. Visibility was down to just a few feet, and the trail became harder to see, the path obscured by the mist. I stopped to pull out my map, but as I was studying it, I heard something. A faint sound, almost like a voice carried by the wind. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like someone was calling out, their voice barely rising above the gusts. I froze for a moment, trying to decipher the sound. It was hard to pinpoint where it was coming from, as the wind seemed to swirl around me from every direction. I shook my head. Maybe it was just my imagination, or perhaps it was the wind playing tricks on me. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I tucked the map back into my pocket and started walking again, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling gnawing at me. The fog grew thicker, and the visibility dropped even further. The trail had started to curve downward, heading toward what looked like a small valley nestled between two ridges. I could just make out the shapes of trees ahead, but everything seemed washed out and muted. That's when I saw it. A figure, barely visible through the thick mist, stood at the edge of the trail. It was a man, tall and thin, dressed in what appeared to be dark clothing. He didn't seem to notice me at first, but as I got closer, he turned slowly, his eyes meeting mine. His gaze was cold, lifeless, sent a chill down my spine. I stopped in my tracks, my heart racing. I hadn't seen anyone on this trail the entire day, so the appearance of this man was strange. I wasn't sure if he was a hiker like me, but something about the way he stood there, motionless, unsettled me. I couldn't explain it, but my instincts told me something was wrong. Without thinking, I quickly turned around and started heading back up the trail, my pulse pounding in my ears. But just as I took a few steps, I heard the soft crunch of footsteps behind me. I stopped again, heart in my throat. I didn't want to turn around, but I had to know if he was following me. I slowly glanced over my shoulder. The man was still there, only now he was a little closer, standing at the edge of the trail with his head slightly tilted to one side. He hadn't moved much, but the way he stared at me made my stomach twist. I knew I had to keep moving. I turned and broke into a jog, my legs aching from the steep incline, but I couldn't stop. I could feel his presence behind me, like a shadow I couldn't escape. The fog was closing in, and the air was thick with the smell of wet earth and pine. The sound of my breath and the pounding of my heart were the only things I could hear as I pushed myself up the hill. I glanced back once more, but I saw nothing. The man was gone. I reached the top of the hill and stopped, gasping for air. I could feel the sweat on my forehead, despite the cold, and my mind raced. Was he just another hiker, or had I imagined the whole thing? I didn't know, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I checked my map again, desperate to get my bearings. I could still hear the wind howling, the fog swirling around me. The valley below seemed to beckon, but something told me I should turn back. I had no idea how far I'd gone, and I was starting to feel disoriented. I decided to head back down the trail. I retraced my steps, trying to stay calm, but the silence was deafening. My ears rang, and every step I took seemed to echo in the stillness. The trail felt different on the way back. The fog was thicker now, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every few moments, I'd turn around, but the trail behind me was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. Eventually, after what felt like hours, I came across a small clearing. I paused for a moment, trying to gather my thoughts. That's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure was standing at the far end of the clearing, just beyond the trees. The same man. His posture was exactly the same, frozen, watching me from a distance. This time, I didn't hesitate. My legs moved before I could think, and I sprinted down the trail with everything I had. My breath came in ragged gasps as I pushed myself harder, willing my body to keep moving. I didn't know if the man was following me again, but I couldn't risk it. The trail seemed endless, the trees around me blurring as I ran, my feet pounding the earth. I didn't stop, even when I heard the crunching of footsteps behind me once more. They were closer this time, faster. Just when I thought I couldn't run anymore, I saw it. An opening ahead, the end of the trail, a small parking lot with a few cars. I surged forward, my legs burning with exhaustion, and didn't stop until I reached the lot. I glanced back, my chest heaving, but the man wasn't there. There was no one following me. The trail was silent. I collapsed on a bench, trying to catch my breath, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't just escaped from a random hiker. It wasn't just a bad encounter. Something about that man, his stillness, his presence, felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. But I was safe now. I had made it. I had outpaced whatever it was that had been chasing me. The hike was over, and I would never come back to this trail again. It was the end of September when I decided to take a solo hiking trip through the northern woods of Wyoming. The leaves had started to turn, shades of orange and red lighting up the forest like a painting, and I figured I could use the time alone. Just me, my backpack, and the outdoors. There was something freeing about it. I had done hikes before, nothing too crazy, but this trail was one I'd heard about from a guy at the local outdoor store. It was supposed to be quiet, untouched. No tourists. Perfect for a peaceful getaway. He warned me it could get a little isolated, but that was exactly what I was looking for. The trailhead was on a back road off the highway, hidden behind a line of dense trees. I parked my truck at the small gravel lot, got my gear ready, and set off just as the sun started to dip behind the peaks. The temperature was comfortable, around 60 degrees, and there wasn't a cloud in the sky. The kind of evening that made you think everything was going to be fine. The path was narrow, the soil soft and slightly damp from the previous day's rain. As I walked, I could hear nothing but the sound of my boots crunching against the dirt and the occasional rustling of leaves. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, like the forest was holding its breath. I spent the first couple of hours lost in my thoughts, just breathing in the fresh air and letting my mind wander. The trail zigzagged through thick trees, up and down small ridges before reaching a stream. I paused for a moment, leaned against a large rock by the water, and pulled out my map to check my progress. The forest was dense here, the trees tightly packed. Even though it was still light out, I could already feel a sort of unease creeping over me. There was a stillness to this place that made it feel off, like something wasn't quite right. After a short break, I pushed forward, knowing I had another 3 or 4 miles before I'd set up camp. The trail was supposed to split into a few different directions, and I planned on picking one of the more secluded campsites further north. I didn't mind the extra hike. I wanted the solitude. As I continued, I started to feel like I wasn't alone. There's a way the forest can make you feel like that, like eyes are on you watching from between the trees. It wasn't until I came across an old, abandoned cabin hidden deeper in the woods that the feeling really settled in. The cabin was weathered, with a few broken windows and a collapsed roof. It wasn't on any of the maps, but it wasn't surprising. This area had been neglected for years. The sight of it unsettled me, not because of its condition, but because it felt like it had been left there on purpose, like someone didn't want anyone to find it. I glanced around, scanning the trees behind me. There was nothing, no sign of movement, yet that feeling, that sense of being watched, was still there. I kept going, shaking off the odd thought. The sun was setting now, painting the sky with pinks and purples, and I had to keep moving if I wanted to get to my campsite before dark. The trail twisted again, leading me up a small hill. As I crested it, I saw the last section of the trail ahead of me, a steep descent into a valley. I was about to make my way down when I saw something unusual in the distance. A figure standing at the bottom of the hill, at the edge of the trees. For a moment, I thought it was another hiker, but there was something strange about the way they were standing. Too still, too quiet. I froze, trying to make out any details. The figure was wearing dark clothes, too dark for the fading light, and they stood perfectly still, like they were waiting for something. Maybe waiting for me. I called out, thinking it was just a fellow hiker, but no response. I tried again, this time louder. Still nothing. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and the sense of unease grew stronger. I wanted to call out again, but something stopped me. Instead, I slowly started backing up, stepping carefully as I moved. My heart pounded, and the silence of the woods seemed to close in around me. It felt like every sound, every movement was being amplified. My breath was the loudest thing I could hear. I kept my eyes on the figure as I retreated up the hill. As I did, I could swear I saw them twitch, just a slight movement in the shadows. It wasn't natural. The figure was wrong. I couldn't explain why, but I knew I needed to get out of there. I turned around and began walking faster, trying to keep my pace steady despite the growing panic. The path ahead was dimming, the last light of day fading. I had to get to the campsite, but the idea of being anywhere near that person or whatever it was unbearable. I didn't hear any footsteps behind me, but I didn't take any chances. Every crack of a twig, every rustling leaf made me jump. It felt like the entire forest was closing in, like the trees themselves were watching. And that figure, was it following me? Or was I just imagining it? By the time I reached the campsite, the forest was nearly dark. I threw my gear down and hastily set up my tent, my hands shaking as I worked. The fire pit was empty, the area around it cold and silent. I didn't feel like making a fire. I didn't want to draw attention. Instead, I huddled inside the tent, my flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. The minutes ticked by, each one slower than the last. I tried to relax, tried to convince myself that I had been overreacting, that the figure was just another hiker who had decided to camp nearby. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The night wore on and the temperature dropped. The silence outside was suffocating, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig in the distance. I couldn't sleep, not with that nagging sense of danger creeping in again. Around midnight, I heard something. It was faint at first, a soft noise that I couldn't quite place. But then it became clearer. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, like someone was walking around the campsite. I froze, barely breathing, trying to listen. The footsteps weren't heavy like a bear or deer. No, these were human footsteps. I was sure of it. I held my breath and listened harder, the sound of the footsteps growing closer. Whoever it was moving deliberately, stepping lightly but with a purpose. Then came the sound of something scraping against the side of my tent. Panic surged through me. I scrambled for my knife, the only weapon I had, and gripped it tightly. My heart pounded in my chest, almost deafening in the silence. The scraping stopped. I could feel my breath catch in my throat, and the world outside my tent seemed to hold its breath with me. Then, through the thin walls of my tent, I heard a voice. It was low and gruff, and it sent a chill through my bones. "Don't run." The words sent a jolt of terror through me. I didn't move. I didn't dare to. The voice wasn't familiar, but there was something deeply unsettling about it. It didn't sound like anyone I'd met. It was wrong. The tone was cold, calculated. I pressed my back against the tent wall, trying to keep my breathing quiet, my body stiff with fear. I thought about running, but where could I go? There was no way out. The forest was vast, and I was miles from civilization. My truck was parked on the other side of the trailhead, but there was no way I could make it there now without being seen. Then the footsteps started moving again, slowly, deliberately. They circled my tent, each step calculated, like the person knew exactly where I was. I could hear them breathing, a faint rasp in the cold night air. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the footsteps stopped. Everything went silent again. I didn't dare make a sound. Minutes passed, and I finally gathered the courage to peer out of the tent's small opening. There was nothing. The area around my camp was still and empty, but I knew someone was out there, and they weren't just watching me. They were waiting. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, listening to every noise, every rustle. I don't know when, but at some point, the footsteps stopped. I never saw whoever it was again. The silence in the morning felt just as heavy, the forest just as oppressive. When I packed up and left, I didn't look back. I didn't take the trail I'd originally planned to follow. I cut across through thick woods, keeping an eye on my surroundings, always feeling like something was just behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the road. The moment I got to my truck, I didn't even hesitate. I jumped in, started the engine, and drove. And when I looked back in the rearview mirror, I saw nothing but the empty forest stretching out behind me. But I knew I'd been followed, and someone had been waiting. It was supposed to be a simple hike, a weekend trip into the woods, just to escape the grind of the city. I hadn't been on a serious hike in years, but my friend Noah, who'd always been the more outdoorsy type, convinced me to join him. He had planned the whole thing, picking a trail deep in the mountains, far from the usual touristy spots, the kind of place where you could really disconnect from everything. He said it was a perfect way to unwind, get some fresh air, and do something challenging. I wasn't exactly thrilled by the idea of leaving my comfort zone, but Noah had always been the kind of guy who made things sound easy, even when they weren't. So I packed my bag with basic hiking gear: a water bottle, a flashlight, some snacks, and my phone, which I hoped I wouldn't need but brought just in case. We drove out early that morning, the sun barely peeking over the horizon as we left the city behind. The ride was smooth for the most part, with the occasional stretch of winding road that made me feel a bit uneasy, especially when we passed through forests so thick you could barely see the sky above. After about 3 hours, we reached the trailhead. It wasn't marked on most maps, which made it feel more like a hidden gem than a popular hike. Noah, being the experienced hiker, was already excited to get going, adjusting his backpack and checking his gear while I tried to gather my thoughts. I was no expert, but I had done my share of walking and day trips, so I thought I'd be fine. Still, there was something off about the place. The woods felt too quiet. No chirping birds, no rustling leaves, just stillness. It was unsettling. The trail itself was narrow and overgrown in parts, with tall trees pressing in on either side. As we started our hike, the sound of our boots crunching on the dirt was the only noise that broke the silence. The sun was still low in the sky, casting long shadows over the path, but it was getting warmer as the morning wore on. For the first few hours, everything went smoothly. The air was crisp, and I could smell the earth, the pine, and the distant scent of something floral. We stopped every so often to catch our breath and have a snack. Noah talked about different plants and animals along the way, showing me things I'd never noticed. It was actually kind of nice, despite the uneasy feeling I couldn't shake. Maybe I was just overthinking it. Around midday, after we'd crossed a small stream and started climbing a steeper incline, something changed. I felt it before I saw it. A heaviness in the air. The forest, which had been so still before, now felt oppressive. The temperature dropped slightly, and there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, like the whole place was holding its breath. Noah seemed to notice it too, but he didn't say anything. He just kept walking, eyes forward, his usual upbeat attitude gone. We kept moving, pushing ourselves through the increasingly difficult terrain. The trail started to twist and wind, the trees growing thicker and more densely packed together. There were fewer signs of any wildlife now, no birds, no insects. It felt like we were in a place untouched by time, the world outside this forest not even existing anymore. At one point, Noah stopped and pointed out a trail marker, a faded piece of plastic tied to a tree, but there was something strange about it. It was old, almost weathered beyond recognition, and there was something about the way it had been placed, like it hadn't been touched in years. At that moment, I felt my stomach tighten. Something didn't feel right. We continued on for another hour, the trail becoming less and less defined. The terrain was rougher now, with rocks and roots jutting out of the ground. My feet were starting to ache, and I could tell Noah was getting tired too. He'd been leading the way, but now he was moving slower, his eyes scanning the trees ahead. We reached a small clearing, and Noah stopped. He pulled out a map, staring at it for a moment, then looked up at the sky. The light was beginning to fade, casting a soft orange glow across the landscape. I could see the exhaustion in his face now. He usually had boundless energy, but the fatigue was starting to show. "I think we should set up camp here," he said, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "It's getting late, and we're not exactly sure how much further the trail goes. Better to be safe than sorry." I agreed. I wasn't eager to push further, especially with the way the atmosphere had changed. There was a strange feeling that had settled over me, like we were being watched. Noah started gathering firewood, and I helped him. As I bent down to pick up a few branches, I heard a faint noise, barely noticeable at first, a rustling in the trees. I froze, my heart racing. It was far off, maybe a few hundred yards, but it sounded wrong, too deliberate, too close. I glanced at Noah, but he didn't seem to hear it. I felt a sense of unease in my gut, the kind that makes your skin crawl. We set up the tent and lit a fire, the crackling flames breaking the silence around us. I tried to push the strange feeling out of my mind, but it kept nagging at me. Every now and then, I would catch a glimpse of movement in the trees, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. Night fell quickly, and the forest seemed to close in around us. The firelight danced and flickered, casting eerie shadows on the trees. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something standing just outside the reach of the fire, but nothing appeared. Still, the sensation that we were not alone grew stronger. After a while, Noah sat down beside the fire, rubbing his eyes. "I'm going to sleep early tonight," he said, his voice hoarse. "We can start fresh in the morning." I nodded, though I didn't feel like sleeping. My mind was racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching us. The night dragged on. I stayed awake, staring into the flames, hearing the occasional snap of a branch in the distance. It was getting harder to ignore the sense that something or someone was lurking in the shadows. Around midnight, I heard it again, that rustling, closer this time. I shot up from my seat, my heart pounding in my chest. I scanned the trees, my eyes straining in the darkness. There was nothing. I told myself it was just the wind, but deep down I knew it wasn't. Noah was asleep, snoring lightly beside the fire. I should have woken him, but I didn't. I didn't want to sound paranoid. I didn't want to scare him. Instead, I kept my eyes trained on the dark edges of the clearing, waiting for any sign of movement. An hour passed. The noise stopped, but the unease remained, thicker than before. Finally, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight, my hand trembling, and stepped out of the tent. The air felt cold now, the kind of cold that sinks deep into your bones. I shined the light around the clearing, but everything was still. The fire had burned low, casting long, stretching shadows. But there was no movement. No one was there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. Something was off. I turned around to head back to the tent, but as I did, I froze. I thought I saw something, just at the edge of the light, a figure, It was tall, impossibly tall, standing still in the dark just beyond the clearing. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel its presence. It was watching me, and for a moment, I thought my heart might stop beating. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. I didn't wait another second. I rushed back to the tent, zipped it up, and huddled inside, my chest tight with fear. I didn't dare to look outside again. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I barely slept, my mind spinning with thoughts of that figure. What had I seen? Was it just my mind playing tricks on me? Or was something actually out there? When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, I felt a strange sense of relief. We packed up quickly, both of us eager to leave the forest behind. The hike back was quiet. The same unsettling silence clung to the air. But this time, I didn't care. I just wanted to get out. By the time we reached the car, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The road back to the city never looked so good. We didn't talk much on the drive home, both of us lost in our own thoughts. But I could tell Noah had felt it too. Whatever was out there in those woods, we'd both felt it. When I got home, I found myself checking over my shoulder more often than usual. The woods had left their mark on me. The stillness, the shadows, the feeling of being watched. I would never forget it. I didn't go hiking again for a long time after that. The rain started that morning, just as I was packing up my gear. It wasn't expected. The weather forecast had been clear, but as I zipped up my bag, I could feel the moisture in the air. I had been planning this hiking trip for months, an escape from the busy city, a few days in the mountains to clear my head. Alone, I needed that. I had chosen the Willow Creek Trail, a remote path tucked deep into the North Cascade Range in Washington. The place was known for its serene beauty, dense forests, and rugged cliffs, but also for its isolation. Not many hikers ventured this far out anymore. Most were put off by the heavy rain season, and others just found it too tough. It wasn't a tourist trap, that's for sure. I parked my car at the trailhead around noon, under a cloudy sky. The trees around me were thick, their branches heavy with rain from the previous night. The ground was wet and slick, and my boots made soft squelching sounds as I moved down the path. The trail started easy enough, a well-maintained path that wound through tall pines and thick underbrush. The smell of wet earth mixed with pine resin, a scent I always found comforting. The first couple of hours went by without incident. The trail was quiet. The only sounds were the rustling leaves above and the occasional drip of water falling from branches. I took my time, stopping now and then to catch my breath, take in the scenery, and check the map. By late afternoon, the clouds had thickened. The wind picked up, and the rain became heavier, but I was prepared. I had a rain jacket, extra layers, and a sturdy tent set to be set up when I found a good spot. I was already a few miles in, and I figured I could make it to the next shelter by nightfall. That's when I noticed something odd. It started as a shadow in the trees. At first, I thought it was just the low light or perhaps my eyes playing tricks on me. But after a few minutes of walking, I caught a glimpse again. It was moving. Not much, just a slight shift behind a group of thick pines, as if someone was ducking out of view. I stopped. My heart rate picked up a bit. I hadn't seen another hiker all day. I didn't feel threatened, but I did feel uneasy. The trail wasn't that wide, and if someone had been close enough to move like that, they would have heard me. I shook my head, dismissing it as my imagination running wild, the rain and the isolation messing with my mind. I continued walking, but the uneasy feeling lingered. The deeper I went into the forest, the more isolated I felt. I couldn't hear any birds or animals anymore, just the rustling of the wind and the constant thrum of rain. The trees seemed taller here, and the shadows stretched longer. I glanced at my watch. It was almost 6, and the light was beginning to fade. I picked up my pace, hoping to make it to the shelter before it got too dark. As I neared a clearing, I saw it. There, at the far edge of the forest, stood a figure. A person standing still, half hidden by the trees. I froze. The figure didn't move. It was just there. The hood of their jacket was pulled low over their face, and they stood with their back to me. I stood there for a few long seconds, waiting, not sure what to do. The rain poured down, but the air was oddly still. "Hello," I called out, though I immediately regretted it. My voice felt too loud in the stillness of the forest. The figure didn't respond. They just stood there, unmoving. My gut told me to turn around and leave, but I fought it. Maybe it was just another hiker, a lone traveler like me, out here in the rain. I took a step forward. Still nothing. No movement, no sound. My heart was pounding now. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Another step. This time, I called out again, louder. "Are you okay?" There was a sudden rustle in the bushes, and then the figure was gone. Vanished. 1 second they were there, and the next there was nothing but rain and trees. I couldn't move. My mind raced. Had they seen me? Had they been waiting for me to get closer? I looked around frantically, my breath shallow. I stood there for what felt like hours, though it was probably just a few minutes. The rain kept falling, and the silence pressed in. Then I made the decision to turn around. There was no point in pushing forward. It wasn't safe. Whatever I had seen, whatever that person was, had spooked me enough. I had no business being out here alone anymore. I retraced my steps, my pace quickening as the light faded further. The forest around me felt different now, more oppressive. The shadows seemed deeper. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I neared a bend in the trail, I heard something. Footsteps, light and careful. Someone was following me. I stopped dead in my tracks, listening hard. The footsteps stopped. Silence. I took a step back, hoping to get a glimpse of whoever it was. Nothing. The path ahead was clear, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I kept moving, quicker now, trying to push past the fear, trying to ignore the thoughts running through my head. I was alone in the middle of nowhere. There was no one around for miles. My mind was making connections, none of them good. I kept telling myself it was nothing, but the fear was getting harder to ignore. The sky darkened fully, and the rain didn't let up. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, my eyes darting to the woods on either side. I didn't know how much longer I could keep this up. The trail was getting rougher, and I wasn't sure how much farther the shelter was. My legs were already sore from the long hike, and the added fear of someone stalking me was draining me faster than I expected. Then I saw it, the small wooden shelter, barely visible through the trees. I felt a surge of relief. It wasn't much, just a small structure with a tin roof, but it would be enough to get me out of the rain. I ran toward it, desperate for some sort of safety. But as I reached the door, something caught my eye. Movement, just outside the shelter. The figure, standing there, half hidden by the rain. I froze. The figure hadn't been there a second ago. I hadn't heard them approach. My chest tightened. I looked around. There was no way out. The shelter had one door and no windows to speak of. The trees were too thick to run through. My only choice was to confront this person. I grabbed the door handle, turned it, and stepped inside. There was no one there. I was alone. The shelter smelled of damp wood and stale air, the fire pit in the center cold and empty. I closed the door quickly behind me and bolted it shut. I leaned against the wall, breathing heavily, trying to calm my racing heart. The rain pounded against the roof, and the wind howled through the cracks in the walls. But I was safe, I thought, at least for now. I spent the rest of the night inside, too scared to sleep. My mind raced with thoughts of what had happened. I couldn't shake the image of the figure, standing in the rain, just watching. Had they been following me the entire time? Why hadn't they approached me earlier? Why did they stay so far away? By morning, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. I knew I had to get out of there. I packed my things quickly, not wanting to stay in the shelter a moment longer. The fear still lingered, but I forced myself to focus. I had to keep moving. As I made my way back down the trail, the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days. It felt like a blessing, the warmth of the light slowly calming my nerves. I didn't see the figure again. I didn't hear any more footsteps. I made it back to the trailhead without incident, and when I saw my car waiting for me, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of relief. I never went hiking in that area again. And to this day, I still don't know who that person was or what they wanted. But one thing I learned on that trip, sometimes it's better not to know. I remember the day I set out on the hike through the Amazon rainforest like it was yesterday. The air was thick, sticky, and heavy with the smell of wet earth and decaying plant life. The heat was relentless. I had been preparing for this trip for months, having finally convinced myself that I could handle it. An adventure that promised to be the ultimate test of endurance and willpower. The year was 2023. I was 32 years old, and though I'd done my share of hiking, this was something far beyond the trails in national parks or the mile treks I'd done in the Rockies. The Amazon was an entirely different beast. I was going in with the goal of seeing the wild side of the world, capturing moments through my camera and soaking in the raw beauty of one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. I had a guide, Raul, a man in his 40s who had grown up in the jungle. He was lean, his skin dark and leathery from years under the sun. He had a quiet confidence that put me at ease, at least at first. His knowledge of the jungle seemed to be second nature, as though he could sense every rustle in the leaves, every subtle shift in the wind. The plan was simple. We would be out for about a week, trekking from a small research station near the river deep into the heart of the jungle, where few people ever ventured. The area wasn't exactly untouched by humans, but it had been some time since anyone had been in there. That's why Raul and I had been chosen. My camera gear and his expertise were a perfect match for the research project. We weren't alone, though. There were a couple of others who had been around the research station, but I hadn't met them yet. They would be catching up with us later. The first couple of days were physically demanding but manageable. The jungle didn't let up, and the heat gnawed at my skin. We moved carefully, following narrow trails that were sometimes just barely wide enough for us to pass through. There was a constant hum in the air, chirping insects, distant animal calls, the rustling of unseen creatures. There was a moment when I thought I heard something move in the bushes beside us, but when I looked, nothing was there. I shrugged it off. I was starting to get used to the idea that the Amazon was alive in ways I couldn't fully understand. The nights were the worst. When the sun dipped below the horizon, the jungle transformed. The sounds of the day faded into something deeper, more primal. We set up camp beneath a giant tree that had roots like tendrils, reaching deep into the earth. The ground was uneven, covered in thick, damp leaves. I could feel the weight of the jungle pressing in on me from every direction. Every sound was magnified in the darkness. The snap of a twig, the croak of a distant frog, the unsettling rustle of leaves that I couldn't quite place. I tried to focus on the stars above. There was something calming about them, though even that felt distant, like the sky itself was holding its breath. Raul didn't seem bothered by the noise. He was a man of few words, and when he did speak, it was often about the jungle, its plants, its animals, its dangers. At night, he would sit by the fire and tell me about the things to avoid. Certain plants that could kill you with a single touch, snakes that blended in so well with the environment that you'd never see them until it was too late. And always there were the jaguars. "Don't worry about the jaguars," he said once, his voice low and measured. "They won't bother you unless they feel threatened." It was the first time I had ever heard someone speak of jaguars so casually. But then again, Raoul had spent his whole life around them. By the third day, I was beginning to notice things. Little things at first. We had crossed a shallow stream, and I saw something strange. Footprints in the mud, large ones. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light or maybe an animal's prints. But they were too human-shaped. The size, the way the toes were imprinted in the mud, it was unmistakable. I showed Raoul, but he didn't seem concerned. "It's probably just someone else," he said dismissively. "This is not an unvisited place, you know?" I had my doubts, but I didn't press him. What else could I do? The tracks weren't recent, but something about them unsettled me. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't the only ones out here. The feeling grew worse as we pushed deeper into the jungle. By the fourth day, the thick trees began to thin, and we found ourselves navigating through dense underbrush and muddy, slippery ground. I had to keep my eyes on my footing, the trail barely visible in some areas. Every now and then, Raoul would stop, his head tilting slightly as though listening for something, but he never said anything. His eyes, though, seemed sharper, like he was watching the surroundings with an intensity one couldn't fully comprehend. That night, things started to change. The air was heavy, charged with an electric tension that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Raoul seemed to sense it too, but he didn't say a word. We set up camp earlier than usual, the fire crackling, the smell of burning wood filling the air. The jungle around us felt off, like something was wrong. I tried to push the unease aside, telling myself I was just tired. But then, as I sat by the fire, I noticed something strange. Movement just outside the light's reach. I froze. For a second, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, but the movement was real. Something or someone was standing just beyond the edge of the firelight, barely visible in the shadows. It wasn't the usual rustling of an animal. This was deliberate, slow, almost like it was watching us. Raoul stood up suddenly, his face tense. He didn't say anything, but I saw him grab his machete from the ground and move toward the trees. I wanted to call out to him, but my voice wouldn't come. The fire crackled and popped, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. I stood up, my legs shaking, and took a step toward the tree line. But just as quickly, Raoul returned, his machete still in hand, his expression unreadable. "There's nothing out there," he said, his voice low but firm. I wanted to believe him, but something deep inside me told me that whatever had been watching us was still out there. And I couldn't shake the thought that it wasn't an animal. It was something far worse. That night, sleep didn't come easy. Every sound, every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves, kept me on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being hunted, though I couldn't tell by what. The next day, the feeling grew stronger. The jungle felt quieter somehow, and I kept seeing those strange, large footprints. The air had grown thick, suffocating, as though the entire forest was holding its breath. And then we stumbled upon the camp. At first, I thought it was ours. It looked familiar, like something we had passed earlier. But when I took a closer look, I realized it wasn't. It was a small clearing, a pile of broken branches and a few discarded items. There were no signs of life, but the way everything was arranged was wrong. It looked disturbed, like someone or something had been here recently. I motioned to Raoul, but he was already shaking his head. His face was tight, and his eyes darted around, as though expecting something to emerge from the jungle at any moment. He grabbed my arm and pulled me away from the site, urgency in his movements. "We need to move," he said quickly. "Now." I didn't ask any questions. I followed him as he led the way, the jungle closing in around us, the path becoming harder to follow. The rest of the day passed in a blur. We made little progress, and by dusk, the jungle seemed to close around us completely. The feeling of being watched had only intensified. The quiet, the stillness, something wasn't right. And then we heard it. A soft, distant sound. A hum like someone singing. It was faint, barely audible above the natural sounds of the jungle, but it was unmistakable. Raoul stopped in his tracks, his body rigid. I turned to him, but he didn't look at me. Instead, he was scanning the darkness, his eyes wide with fear. He grabbed me, pulling me behind a thick tree trunk. "You need to stay here," he whispered urgently. "Stay silent. Do not move." I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. Whatever was out there, it was close now. Too close. Raoul crept forward, moving soundlessly through the underbrush. I watched him disappear into the darkness, my breath shallow as I strained my ears to listen. The humming grew louder, clearer. It wasn't human. It was something wrong. I don't know how long I sat there, my heart hammering in my chest. It felt like an eternity before Raoul returned, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. I could see it in his eyes. We didn't speak a word as we made our way back. We didn't camp that night. We walked and we kept walking until we found the first signs of civilization. It was another day before I fully understood what had happened. Raoul had refused to talk, but I had pieced it together. We had been hunted by a man. The rest of the story is hazy, and I can't speak of it in full detail. Raoul's silence spoke volumes, but we made it out, and I learned that not everything in the jungle is an animal. Some things wear human skin, and they are far worse than anything the wild could offer. It's been over a year since I lost Sarah. Sometimes it feels like just yesterday, and other times it feels like a lifetime ago. The pain of losing her is still raw, but I'm trying to find ways to keep going. I don't know what made me think that hiking would help, but there I was, standing at the trailhead at the edge of the forest, the cold mountain air biting at my skin. I used to take Sarah hiking all the time. We loved the quiet, the way the world seemed to fade away as we trekked through the trees. She had always been more of a nature lover than I was, but I loved seeing the joy in her face when we were out there, away from the distractions of everyday life. Today, though, it was different. She wasn't beside me, and I was out here on my own. I needed to prove to myself that I could handle being out here without her. I needed to find some kind of peace, some sense of normalcy, even if it was just for a few hours. I looked up at the mountain trail that wound through the forest and narrowed my eyes against the rising sun. The trail was well marked, though I knew it would soon become more rugged the further I went. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, my boots crunching on the frost-covered earth. The first few steps felt almost comforting, the crunch of my feet in sync with the beating of my heart. It wasn't long before the trees began to close in around me. The forest was dense, the branches above so thick that they blocked out most of the sunlight. I could hear the occasional bird call, but otherwise it was eerily quiet. Too quiet. I paused for a moment, taking in the stillness. Something felt off. It wasn't like the usual peace I'd come to expect from a forest. I shook my head. My nerves were probably just heightened. It had been a while since I'd hiked alone, and the solitude was messing with my mind. I forced myself to keep moving. As I trekked deeper into the forest, the air grew colder, and a light fog began to settle in. It curled around the trunks of the trees, making everything look blurry and distant. The trail seemed to go on forever, winding through the trees and climbing higher as the mountain began to rise sharply ahead. I wasn't sure how far I wanted to go today. I hadn't planned on a long hike. My goal was just to get out and feel like I could still do something on my own. That's when I heard it. A noise, a rustling. I froze. It was coming from somewhere ahead of me, off the trail, but the trees were so thick that I couldn't see past them. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The sound stopped, leaving only silence in its wake. I stood there, trying to convince myself it was just an animal, probably a deer or maybe a bear. The forest was full of wildlife. There was no reason to panic, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I took a cautious step forward, my eyes scanning the trees. The rustling had been to my left, so I veered slightly off the trail, moving in that direction. My heart began to pound faster with every step, and then I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the tree line. It was a man, tall, maybe in his late 40s or early 50s, wearing a dark jacket and a thick pair of pants. He was standing completely still, as if he were waiting for something, or someone. I didn't know what to do. I had no idea how long he had been standing there, how long he had been watching me. I took another step, trying to gauge his reaction. His face was obscured by a dark hood, but I could see his eyes, cold, unsettling eyes that didn't seem to blink. I didn't want to make a sound. I didn't want to startle him or make him think I was a threat. But at the same time, I felt an instinctive urge to get away, to put distance between us. I slowly turned back toward the trail, my eyes never leaving him. That's when he moved. Not quickly. He didn't charge at me or anything like that, but there was something deliberate in his movements. He didn't step out from the trees. Instead, he just seemed to melt into the shadows. I couldn't explain it. One moment he was there, and the next he was gone. I blinked, wondering if I had imagined the whole thing. The fog was thickening now, and the trail was becoming harder to see. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. My instincts were telling me to turn back, to leave. But I wasn't sure if it was fear or just the weight of everything I'd been carrying with me since Sarah died. Maybe I was just overreacting. Maybe it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the unease. I decided to press on, but I kept my eyes darting between the trees, watching for any sign of movement. The wind picked up, making the branches sway and creak, and the fog thickened, obscuring the trail in front of me. As I walked, the sound of something snapping twigs behind me reached my ears. I stopped. I wasn't alone. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the area behind me. Nothing. I waited, and then I heard it again. A twig snapping underfoot, followed by the sound of something else moving through the underbrush. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't alone. I started walking faster, my heart hammering in my chest. But it felt like the sounds were getting closer. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear the footsteps, steady and deliberate, following me. I broke into a jog, pushing myself harder, my legs burning with the effort. The forest around me felt like it was closing in, the fog thickening with every step. My breath came in short gasps as I pushed through the brush, the sound of footsteps still echoing in my ears. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence was deafening. I stopped running, my chest heaving with exhaustion, my body drenched in sweat. I turned in circles, trying to catch a glimpse of whoever had been following me, but the trees were empty. No one was there. I waited a long time before I started moving again, every step cautious, my eyes scanning the trees for any sign of life. But as the minutes passed, I began to wonder if it had all been in my head. Maybe I was just losing my mind. That's when I saw it. A figure standing at the end of the trail. It was the same man. His hood was pulled back now, revealing a gaunt face with a sharp, unnerving smile. He wasn't standing in the shadows anymore. He was right in front of me, blocking my path. I stood frozen, unable to move. The world around me seemed to tilt, the fog swirling, distorting everything. The only thing that was clear was him, his eyes, cold and empty, fixed on me. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't find the words. I couldn't make my body obey me. And then, as quickly as it had all started, he was gone. The man vanished into the fog, as if he had never been there at all. I stood there, shaking, my heart pounding in my ears. But I wasn't alone. Not anymore. I don't know how long I stood there, just staring into the thick fog, but eventually, I found the strength to move. I turned around and ran, full sprint, back down the trail. I didn't stop until I reached the bottom of the mountain, my lungs burning and my legs giving out beneath me. When I finally made it back to the trailhead, I looked over my shoulder one last time. Nothing. The forest was silent, the trail empty, but I knew what I'd seen, and I would never be the same again. I made my way back home that day. I don't know if I'll ever hike alone again, but I do know one thing. That day, in the mountains, something had followed me, and it wasn't just my mind playing tricks. Something was out there, something real. It was a crisp October morning, the kind of day where the sun filters through the trees just enough to cast a golden glow on everything, but not warm you up too much. I'd been hiking solo for a few days. The wilderness was my escape, a chance to reset. I was near the Cascade Mountains, a vast expanse of forest, rocky cliffs, and deep ravines. It was the kind of place that drew me in, a spot so far removed from civilization that once you stepped into the woods, you truly felt the isolation. The trail I was on wasn't particularly well known, which is why I liked it. There were no crowds, no tourists, just the sounds of nature. The path I followed curved along a narrow creek, its water trickling over smooth stones. I could hear the soft calls of birds in the distance, the rustling of leaves underfoot, and the occasional snap of a twig. I was in my element. By the time I reached the old lookout tower, I had already been hiking for a solid 6 hours. I'd stopped once or twice for water, but otherwise kept a steady pace. The tower stood in front of me, weathered by time. I always loved this place. There was something peaceful about the sight of it, perched on top of the ridge, almost as if it was keeping watch over the valley below. From up here, you could see miles of thick forest stretching in every direction. No signs of human life, just wilderness as far as the eye could see. I took a deep breath of the cool, pine-scented air and started up the narrow wooden stairs. The structure creaked beneath my weight, a reminder that it had stood here for decades, perhaps longer. When I reached the top, I sat on the edge, letting my legs dangle over the side as I looked out at the view. The valley below was serene, the sun beginning to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the landscape. I wasn't sure how long I'd been sitting there when I noticed something odd, a figure moving through the trees. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but as I focused on it, I realized it was definitely a person. They were walking in the opposite direction of the trail, moving deeper into the forest. It seemed strange because I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail all day, and the figure appeared to be off course, nowhere near any of the established paths. I pulled my pack up and stuffed my water bottle back inside before making my way down from the tower. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to follow the figure. I wasn't sure why I felt the urge to do so, but something about it tugged at me. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe it was just the need for company in such a quiet, remote place. The hike down the trail was quick, and I soon found myself at the spot where I had seen the figure. I stood still for a moment, listening. The woods were quiet again, and there was no sign of movement. I took a few more steps, scanning the area carefully. My eyes caught something: footprints. They were fresh, the earth still disturbed. The prints were deep, like the person was carrying a heavy load or perhaps walking with a limp. I followed the tracks as they veered off the main trail, moving further into the trees. The woods grew denser the further I went, the trees standing close together, their branches forming a thick canopy overhead. The light began to dim, and I could hear the faint sounds of animals rustling in the underbrush. It was quiet, but in a way that felt unnerving, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. After another hour of hiking, I came across something that made me stop dead in my tracks. A small campfire, still smoldering. The fire pit was just off to the side of a narrow, overgrown path, and I could see the faint outline of a tent further up. The flames had burned out, but the area still smelled of smoke. I looked around, my heart rate picking up. No one was around. The tent wasn't much, just a basic, faded green shelter, half collapsed as though it hadn't been used in days. There was a trail of gear leading away from it, an abandoned sleeping bag, a broken flashlight, a cracked water bottle. It all looked hastily discarded, as if the person had left in a hurry. I wasn't sure what to make of it. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but I couldn't quite shake the feeling that someone was still out there. The world around me was silent, almost too silent. I walked carefully over to the camp, inspecting everything I could. It didn't take long for me to realize that the place had been abandoned. There was nothing here that indicated the person had gone anywhere willingly. It all looked as though someone had just disappeared. My thoughts were interrupted by a sound. Footsteps. At first, I thought it was just a deer or another animal, but then I heard it again, closer this time. My pulse quickened. I slowly turned around, scanning the trees. That's when I saw him. He was standing in the shadows, half concealed behind a thick cluster of shrubs, staring directly at me. I couldn't make out his features, but the outline of a man was clear. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore a dark jacket that blended in with the forest. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The forest around me felt heavy, oppressive, as though the air itself had thickened. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. The figure stepped out of the shadows, taking a slow, deliberate step toward me. There was something wrong about the way he moved. Too deliberate, too calm. I tried to take a step back, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I could feel my breath catching in my throat, my pulse racing. Every fiber of my being told me to run, but I couldn't seem to make myself move. Finally, the man spoke, though not in words, just a low, guttural sound that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. It wasn't anything I could understand, just a strange noise that seemed to vibrate in the air. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled with a cold, primal fear. I forced myself to break from the trance, taking a cautious step backward. But it wasn't fast enough. The man lunged toward me, closing the distance in what felt like a second. My heart nearly exploded in my chest as I turned and bolted into the trees. The trail ahead was unclear, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away from him. I stumbled over rocks, branches, and roots, barely managing to keep my footing. My breath came in gasps, my heart pounding so loudly in my chest I was sure he could hear it. I kept running, not daring to look back, but knowing deep down that he was following me. I had no idea how long I had been running, but my legs felt like jelly, my muscles burning with every step. The woods were darker now, the canopy blocking out most of the remaining light. It was easy to lose the trail, to lose yourself in the labyrinth of trees and undergrowth. But I couldn't stop, not now. I tripped over something, tumbling down a small incline. My body hit the ground hard, and I gasped for air. I could hear him now, his footsteps too close for comfort. I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline pushing me forward. The ground began to slope upward again, and I found myself on a narrow ridge. Ahead, I saw something, a small cabin. It looked like an old hunting shack, abandoned like so many others in this part of the forest. Without thinking, I dashed toward it, throwing open the door and slamming it shut behind me. I didn't care if the place was empty or not. At least the walls might offer some kind of protection. I locked the door and pressed my back against it, listening. The woods were quiet again. Too quiet. I waited for what felt like hours, listening for any sound, any sign that he was out there. But nothing came. I eventually allowed myself to collapse onto the cold wooden floor, my body exhausted, my mind still racing. I had no idea who the man was or why he had been in those woods, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going anywhere until morning. And even then, I would take the long way back to the nearest trailhead. Somewhere in the distance, the wind howled, and I realized just how alone I truly was. But at least for now, I was safe. I had spent months planning my solo hike through the Amazon rainforest. It was something I had dreamed of for years, the chance to push myself, to see the raw, untamed wilds of the world's largest jungle. I had read everything I could, studied the maps, prepared my gear meticulously. I knew the dangers: jaguars, venomous snakes, insects that could kill a man in hours, the unforgiving terrain. But nothing could have truly prepared me for what I was about to experience. I arrived in a small town near the Brazilian border, the last real sign of civilization before I would step into the green abyss. The air was thick and heavy, the scent of wet earth and rotting vegetation filling my nose. I made last-minute checks, ensuring I had everything: a machete, a compass, a GPS, purification tablets, enough food for 2 weeks, and a lightweight tent. I had trained for this, and I felt confident. That confidence would not last. The first day was manageable. The jungle was a living, breathing thing, filled with noises that never stopped. The chirping of unseen birds, the rustling of leaves, the distant cries of howler monkeys. I moved carefully, cutting through thick vines, stepping over tangled roots, always mindful of where I placed my feet. A wrong step could mean a twisted ankle or worse. The heat was overwhelming, sweat soaking through my clothes within minutes, but I pushed forward. By the third day, I was deep into the rainforest, the sounds of the town nothing more than a memory. The canopy was so thick that daylight barely reached the forest floor, and the humidity was suffocating. My clothes clung to me like a second skin, my backpack feeling heavier with each passing hour. But I pressed on, following my map and compass, making good time. I camped near a slow-moving river, filtering water before cooking a simple meal of rice and dried meat. It was that night that I first had the feeling, a sensation that I was not alone. I told myself it was paranoia, that my mind was playing tricks on me. The jungle was full of life. Of course, things were moving around me. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I barely slept, my hand resting on my machete, ears straining against the darkness. The next day, I pushed forward, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut. I reminded myself of the plan: keep moving, stick to the route, and trust my training. But the deeper I went, the worse the feeling became. I was being watched. I was sure of it now. The jungle had eyes, and they were on me. Tracks in the mud. Not animal tracks. Human. Barefoot. I stopped cold, staring at the imprint in the soft earth. It wasn't just one set. There were multiple. Some fresh, some older. My skin prickled. I had read about uncontacted tribes, about illegal loggers, about dangers beyond the wildlife. I had hoped to avoid them. Now, it seemed I wasn't alone after all. I quickened my pace, determined to put as much distance between myself and whoever had left those tracks. The jungle closed in tighter around me, the air thick with tension. Every sound made me jump. A snapping branch, a rustling leaf. My heart pounded. I kept moving. By the 6th day, I was exhausted. I hadn't seen anyone, but I knew I wasn't imagining things. Food was running lower than I expected, my appetite gone from the stress. My GPS was acting strangely, glitching, but I still had my map and compass. I was sure I was on track, but something was wrong. That night, as I set up camp, I found another footprint. This one was different. It was closer, too close to where I had slept the night before. Someone had been watching me. My stomach twisted. I didn't light a fire that night. I stayed awake, gripping my machete, straining to hear beyond the endless drone of insects. Hours passed in tense silence. Then, just before dawn, I heard it. A whisper. It wasn't the sound of the jungle. It wasn't the call of an animal. It was low, deliberate, human. My blood ran cold. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The whispering stopped, but I knew someone, or something, was out there. I waited until the first light crept through the trees before I dared to move. I packed in minutes, abandoning anything that wasn't essential. I needed to get out. I moved faster than I had before, my muscles burning, my mind racing. The jungle seemed to close in around me, each shadow a threat, each movement in the brush a warning. I didn't stop to eat, barely stopped to drink. I just kept moving. By midday, I realized I was off course. My compass didn't match my map. Panic surged through me, but I forced it down. I needed to stay calm. I adjusted my course and pressed on, hoping to reach a river that would lead me to safety. But the feeling of being followed never left me. The whispering returned that night, closer this time, more distinct. It wasn't words, but it was human. I knew it. I sat in the darkness, clutching my machete, pulse hammering in my ears. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling my tent. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my pack and ran. I didn't care about the noise. I didn't care about exhaustion. I ran through the jungle, tearing through vines, stumbling over roots, my breath ragged. The footsteps followed. I didn't look back, couldn't. My mind screamed at me to keep moving. By some miracle, I reached the river. The current was strong, but I didn't hesitate. I plunged into the water, letting it carry me downstream. I half swam, half drifted for what felt like hours. When I finally pulled myself onto the muddy bank, I collapsed, gasping for air. The jungle was silent. I didn't know if I had escaped, but I didn't stop. I forced myself up and kept moving along the river. The fear never left me, but I pushed forward, step by step. 2 days later, I stumbled into a logging camp, barely able to speak. They helped me, fed me, listened as I tried to explain. They didn't look surprised. They told me I was lucky. There were things in the jungle, they said. Not animals, not spirits, people. People who didn't want to be found. People who watched. People who waited. I didn't ask questions. I didn't want to know more. I just wanted to leave. When I finally boarded a plane back home, I looked down at the endless green expanse below. I had survived, but the Amazon had changed me. The jungle wasn't just trees and rivers. It was something else entirely, and I would never go back. I was never the type to go hiking alone, but sometimes you make decisions that don't seem wrong until you're too deep in them to turn back. It was early fall when I set out, the kind of season where the air is crisp but not too cold. The leaves are turning, and the woods feel alive in a way that makes you forget how quiet they really are. I had taken time off work and decided to challenge myself with a longer trail, one that went deep into the mountains and had fewer people. I packed well: food, water, a solid knife, and a good map. I wasn't an expert hiker, but I knew enough to be careful. The trail I picked was supposed to be a 3-day loop through thick forest and steep ridges. Nothing too extreme, but isolated enough that I wouldn't run into many other people. That was the appeal. The first day was uneventful. I moved through the trails, feeling good, setting up camp before sundown. I ate, listened to the sounds of the forest, and slept fine. The second day, things started to feel different. It wasn't anything I could put into words at first, just small things. The silence lasted longer between the usual bird calls. The wind moved through the trees in a way that didn't quite feel right. It wasn't enough to make me stop, just enough to sit in the back of my head. I pressed on, reaching a ridge that overlooked miles of dense woods below. My map showed a small creek about a mile ahead, a good spot to refill my water. I followed the trail down, the trees pressing in tighter the deeper I went. The air smelled damp, like wet earth and decaying leaves. I kept moving, but something felt off. I wasn't sure what at first. Then I noticed the flies. They weren't the normal kind, the ones that hovered around damp spots or your food. These were thick, slow-moving, clustering in the air in a way that made my skin crawl. I swatted at them and kept walking, telling myself it was just something dead. A small animal, maybe a deer. The forest takes care of its own. But the smell hit next. It was worse than anything I'd ever smelled before. Thick, rotting sour. It filled my nose, clung to the back of my throat. I tried to breathe through my mouth, but it barely helped. My first instinct was to turn back. I should have. But something about the smell, the way it seemed to drift in one direction, made me want to know what it was. I stepped off the trail, moving slowly, pushing through the underbrush. The flies thickened. The smell got worse. Then I saw it. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was looking at. It was just a shape, something dark against the forest floor. Then the details came into focus. A body. It wasn't fresh. The skin was gray, bloated. Parts of it had been eaten, animals had gotten to it. The face was half gone. The mouth locked open in a way that made my stomach turn. The arms were stretched out, fingers curled into the dirt like the person had been clawing at the ground before they died. I stepped back, my foot catching on a root, my balance shifting. I managed to stay upright, but my body was screaming at me to move. This wasn't an accident. The body wasn't lying in a way that suggested a fall. It looked placed, stretched out, arranged. I wanted to believe it was just someone who got lost and didn't make it. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold. The body had no shoes. The feet were bare, dirty, scratched up. But a few feet away, near the base of a tree, were a pair of boots, perfectly placed side by side, as if someone had taken them off and set them down neatly. Something about that detail made my hands shake. I took a step back, then another. My body was telling me to run, but I forced myself to stay quiet, to move carefully. I turned, heading back toward the trail, my breath coming fast. The woods were too quiet. The usual rustling of animals, the distant sound of birds. It was all gone. Felt like the whole forest was holding its breath. I walked faster. My pack felt heavier. My skin was crawling. I reached the trail, but I didn't stop. I didn't check my map, didn't think. I just moved. Fast. I wanted distance between me and that body. I didn't know what happened, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't supposed to find it. I pushed forward for hours, my legs burning, my heart pounding. I needed to get to a safer spot, somewhere further from whatever I had just walked into. As the sun started to dip, I found a small clearing and forced myself to stop. I needed to rest, to think. I set up my tent quickly, my hands shaking as I worked. I ate without tasting the food. Every noise in the woods made me jump. Then, just as the last light faded, I heard something. Footsteps. Not an animal. Not the rustling of a deer moving through the brush. These were slow, deliberate steps. I stopped breathing. The sound was coming from the direction I had just come from. Then they stopped. I sat there, frozen, every muscle in my body locked in place. Minutes passed. Nothing. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my tent, my knife in my hand, my ears straining for any sound. When morning came, I packed up and left without hesitation. I didn't bother finishing the loop. I went the fastest way back to the nearest trailhead, barely stopping for water. By the time I reached my car, my body was exhausted, my mind numb. I didn't call the police. I should have. But something in me told me that whatever I had stumbled onto, it was bigger than just a lost hiker. I left and never hiked that trail again. Weeks later, I checked the news. Nothing. No missing person reports, no bodies found. It was like it never happened. But I know what I saw, and I know I wasn't alone out there. It was a simple idea. A weekend hiking trip, me, my wife, and her stepbrother. Nothing complicated. Just fresh air, long trails, and a break from the usual routine. We had done hikes before, but this was the first time all three of us were going together. My wife had suggested it, thinking it would be good for us to spend more time with her stepbrother. He had been going through a rough patch lately, something about work stress and needing to clear his head. We planned a 2-day hike deep in the wilderness, a place far from any town, the kind of place where you wouldn't get cell service, and the nearest help would be miles away. We packed light but smart food, water, first aid, a GPS, and a couple of knives just in case. My wife was always good at preparing for things, making sure we had everything we needed. The drive to the trailhead took nearly 4 hours. The last part of the trip was on a dirt road, winding through thick trees. It felt like we were leaving the world behind, going somewhere untouched. When we finally arrived, there were no other cars in the small parking area. Just us. That was fine. We wanted solitude. We set off in the late morning, the sun bright overhead. The trail started off easy, winding through thick pines and rocky paths. Birds chirped in the distance, and every now and then, we'd hear the rustling of small animals moving through the undergrowth. The air smelled fresh, clean, untouched by city pollution. For the first few hours, everything went smoothly. The trail had some steep sections, but nothing too difficult. We took breaks when needed, drinking water and eating small snacks to keep up our energy. My wife led most of the way, with her stepbrother behind her and me taking up the rear. It was quiet except for the sounds of nature around us. As the day wore on, the forest grew denser. The trees towered above us, blocking out much of the sunlight. The air felt cooler, damp. The trail became narrower, less maintained. It was clear that not many people came this way. At one point, we noticed an old sign nailed to a tree. The writing was faded, almost unreadable. What little we could make out warned about unmarked areas ahead. It didn't say much else. My wife hesitated for a moment, but her stepbrother brushed it off. We had a GPS, a map. We weren't worried. By late afternoon, we reached a small clearing where we decided to set up camp. The area was flat, surrounded by trees, and had enough space for our tents. We gathered some wood for a small fire, just enough to keep warm and cook some food. It felt peaceful, being out there in the quiet. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest changed. The sounds of birds were replaced by the occasional rustling in the bushes, the distant call of an animal we couldn't quite place. The air felt heavier, almost too still. We sat around the fire, eating and relaxing. The light from the flames flickered against the trees, creating shifting shadows. My wife's stepbrother seemed a bit on edge. He kept looking around, scanning the dark beyond the firelight. I figured he was just tired. Eventually, we put the fire out and went to our tents. The night was cold, but I managed to fall asleep quickly. Then I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had startled me. The forest was dead silent. No wind, no animals, nothing. I could hear my wife's breathing beside me, steady, calm, but something felt off. I listened carefully, then I heard it, a sound, faint somewhere beyond our camp. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. I froze, my heart pounding. It wasn't an animal. It was too precise, too human. The steps crunched against the forest floor, moving closer, then stopping. Whoever it was, they were watching us. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. I could hear my wife's stepbrother shifting in his tent. He had heard it too. Then the footsteps started again, circling, moving just outside our camp. I strained my eyes in the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. The fire was out, and the moon barely provided any light through the thick trees. Minutes passed, then an hour. The footsteps stopped, but I didn't sleep after that. By morning, it was like nothing had happened. The forest was alive again, birds chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze. My wife didn't notice anything wrong, but her stepbrother and I exchanged a look. We didn't say anything, but we both knew something had been there. We packed up quickly, deciding to cut the trip short. Something felt wrong about this place. We didn't want to stay another night. The hike back started normal. We moved fast, wanting to get back to the car as soon as possible. But after a few hours, my wife's stepbrother stopped suddenly. He pointed at the ground. Footprints, not ours, fresh, leading from the direction we had camped. Someone had been following us. We didn't stop after that. We moved as fast as we could without running, our eyes scanning the trees, listening for any sound. The further we got from our campsite, the more it felt like we were being watched. By the time we reached the car, we were exhausted, but we didn't feel safe yet. We got in, locked the doors, and drove away. It wasn't until we were miles down the road that my wife's stepbrother finally spoke. "There was someone out there last night," he said. I didn't argue. I knew he was right. We never figured out who it was or what they wanted. But the thought of someone out there, in the middle of nowhere, watching us, staying just out of sight, that was enough. We never went back. I was never one to worry much about the outdoors. I had been hiking for years, mostly alone, and I liked the quiet. There was something about being out in the middle of nowhere, away from the noise of daily life, that made everything feel right. I never saw it as dangerous. Sure, I carried the right gear, a knife, a first aid kit, enough food and water, but that was just being smart. I had always believed that if you respected nature, it would respect you back. That belief was wrong. I had planned a long hike in a remote area, deep in the mountains. It wasn't my first time out there, and I had a good understanding of the terrain. The trail wasn't popular, which was why I liked it. No people, no noise, just miles of trees, rocky paths, and the occasional wildlife sighting. The hike was meant to last 3 days, a loop that would bring me back to my truck on the third morning. The first day was uneventful. The air was cool, the sky was clear, and I made good progress. I set up camp near a small creek, cooked a meal, and got some rest. The only sound that night was the wind moving through the trees. The second day, I got up early and continued on. I hiked for hours, stopping only for water and a quick meal. The farther I went, the more rugged the landscape became. The trees thinned out in some areas, giving way to open stretches of land covered in tall grass and scattered rocks. Eventually, I reached a dense forest where the trees blocked out most of the sunlight. That was where things started to feel different. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, a feeling small at first, like I was being watched. I told myself it was nothing, that I had been alone for almost 2 days and my mind was looking for something to focus on. I kept moving, but the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it got worse. I started noticing little things. Twigs snapping in the distance, the way the birds would suddenly go quiet. At one point, I turned around, certain I had heard something behind me, but there was nothing there, just trees and silence. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer, maybe a bear, but I knew better. I had spent years hiking and camping. I knew what it felt like when an animal was nearby. This wasn't that. I kept moving, trying to ignore the growing unease. By late afternoon, I reached the area where I had planned to camp for the night. It was a small clearing, surrounded by thick trees, with just enough space to set up my tent. I was exhausted, but something about the place felt wrong. The ground was disturbed, the way it would be if something had moved through recently. Not an animal, something bigger. Still, I forced myself to set up camp. I built a fire, cooked a quick meal, and tried to shake off the feeling that had settled deep in my gut. The night was colder than the one before. The fire gave off enough warmth, but I felt exposed sitting there. I kept glancing into the trees, expecting to see something staring back at me. Then I heard it, a sound in the distance. Not an animal, not the wind, something moving through the trees, steady and deliberate. Not fast, not slow, just moving. I grabbed my knife and turned toward the sound, my heart pounding. I couldn't see anything, but I knew something was out there. I could feel it. I stood there for what felt like forever, listening. The sound stopped. Silence. Too much silence. The kind that only happens when something is nearby. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, listening, waiting. Nothing else happened, but the feeling never went away. The first light, I packed up and started moving. I had planned to spend another day out there, but I decided to cut the trip short. Something wasn't right, and I wasn't going to stick around to find out what. As I moved through the trees, I kept checking behind me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Then, about an hour into my hike, I saw something. Footprints. Not mine. Fresh ones, heading in the same direction I was going. They weren't boot prints. They weren't animal tracks. They were barefoot. Large, human, but off. The toes were long, the shape strange. I crouched down, staring at them, my stomach twisting. They hadn't been there the day before. Someone had been out here during the night. I stood up and kept moving, faster this time. My plan was simple: get back to my truck as quickly as possible. The forest felt different now. Every shadow felt like it was hiding something. Every sound made my skin crawl. The path ahead felt longer than it should have. The trees felt closer. The air felt heavier. Then, up ahead, I saw something that made my breath catch. A tree. A tall pine, stripped of its bark. Not cut, not scratched, peeled. Long strips of bark had been torn away, leaving pale wood underneath. It wasn't natural. Something had done it. I stepped closer, my heart hammering. That was when I saw what was on the wood. Marks. Deep, jagged scratches running down the length of the tree. Claw marks. No animal I knew left marks like that. The spacing was off, the pattern too deliberate. I ran my fingers over the grooves. They were fresh. I stepped back, gripping my knife, and turned to keep moving. And that was when I saw it. A shape, deep in the trees, just on the edge of my vision. Tall, too tall, not moving, watching. My body locked up. My breathing stopped. I didn't wait. I turned and ran. I ran faster than I ever had in my life. The trees blurred past me. I didn't stop to look back. I didn't stop for anything. I ran until my legs burned, until my lungs felt like they would explode. When I finally saw my truck, I almost collapsed from relief. I fumbled with the keys, yanked the door open, and threw myself inside. My hands were shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to get the engine started. As I pulled onto the road, I finally looked in the rearview mirror. The tree line was empty, but I knew without a doubt that something had been out there. Something had followed me, and it had let me go. Hiking was something I did often. It was never about pushing limits or breaking records, just the quiet, the fresh air, and the feeling of being away from everything. I liked the isolation, the sound of my boots crunching against the dirt, and the way the world seemed simpler when I was deep in the woods. I had done this trail before, nothing technical, just a long stretch of wilderness cutting through the mountains. It had been raining earlier in the week, and the dirt was still soft in places. Patches of mud clung to my boots, and the scent of wet earth was thick in the air. I had packed light, a small backpack with some food, a water bottle, and a knife. Nothing I wasn't used to carrying. The first few hours passed uneventfully. The trees were dense, their branches reaching overhead, forming a natural tunnel. Birds chirped in the distance, and every now and then, I caught the sound of running water. The trail was empty, no other hikers. That was common this time of year. Most people didn't like being alone out here. I didn't think much about it until I noticed something strange. The first sign was the footprints. They were deep, pressed hard into the damp soil, and going in the same direction as me. At first, I ignored them. It wasn't weird to see other hikers' footprints, but these were erratic. Some pressed deep into the mud like someone had been stumbling, others more spaced apart as if they had been running. There were no returning prints. Whoever made them hadn't come back this way. I kept moving. An hour passed, and the sky was shifting. The sun hung lower, dipping behind the trees. The trail curved along a ridge, and from up there, I could see the valley below, thick with trees, the distant glint of a river cutting through it. It was beautiful, but something about it felt wrong, like I was being watched. I shook it off, just my mind playing tricks. But then the smell hit me. Rot. It was faint at first, mixed in with the damp forest air. But as I kept walking, it got stronger, until it was impossible to ignore. Something was dead nearby. I scanned the trail ahead, looking for roadkill, maybe a deer that had wandered too close to a predator. But there was nothing on the path. The smell was coming from the trees. I don't know why I stepped off the trail. Maybe curiosity, maybe instinct, maybe something deeper, something in my gut telling me I was about to find something I wasn't supposed to. The ground was soft, my boots sinking slightly with every step. The trees were close together here, their trunks covered in moss. I moved slowly, brushing past branches, my heart thudding a little harder now. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a pile of clothes, dark, soaked through with mud and leaves. But then my eyes adjusted, and I realized what I was looking at. A body, face down in the dirt, arms bent awkwardly at the sides, legs half buried in the undergrowth. The clothes were torn, and the skin that was visible was pale. Too pale. The smell was worse now, thick and sour, clinging to the air. I stood there for a long time. It didn't move. I don't know how long it had been there, but the way the body was positioned, the way the leaves had started to gather around it, made it clear it hadn't been long. Days, maybe, not weeks. My first thought was to check if they were alive, but I knew before I even took a step that they weren't. The air was too still. There was no rise and fall of breathing, no twitch of movement. I stepped closer anyway. The ground made a wet sound beneath my boots. I crouched down, careful not to touch the body, and looked at the details. The clothes were hiking gear, expensive stuff. A jacket that had once been a bright color but was now stained with mud. Boots that looked brand new. Then I saw the wounds. Deep gashes along the back, cutting through fabric and into flesh. Not the kind of wounds you'd get from falling. Not from an animal either, at least not one I could think of. Something wasn't right. I looked around, scanning the trees, listening. The forest had gone quiet. Too quiet. The birds had stopped. The wind barely moved. I needed to leave. I stood up, backing away from the body, my mind racing. This wasn't an accident. Someone did this. And if they had done it recently, they might still be out here. I turned back toward the trail, moving fast. My boots crunched against the dirt, and with every step, I felt like I was being watched. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. The trees blurred together as I pushed forward. Then I saw something ahead on the trail. More footprints. They hadn't been there before. Fresh ones, leading away from where I had just come from. Someone else was out here. I kept moving faster now. My breathing was heavy, but I forced myself to stay quiet. Every sound felt too loud. My boots, my breath, the rustling of my jacket. I glanced over my shoulder every few steps, but I never saw anything. Just trees, just shadows. It felt like it took forever, but I finally made it back to the spot where the trail split. One way led back the way I had come, back to my car. The other led deeper into the mountains. I didn't hesitate. I took the path back. The sun was almost gone now, the trees stretching long shadows across the trail. I kept moving, forcing myself not to run. Running made noise. Running made mistakes. I just needed to get back to my car. Then I heard it, a branch snapping behind me. I didn't stop. Another sound. Closer. Someone was following me. I picked up the pace, my legs burning, my lungs tight. The trail felt longer than before. The trees felt closer. And then, finally, I saw it, the small clearing where I had parked. My car was still there. I reached into my pocket, fumbling for my keys. My hands were shaking. I glanced back one last time. Nothing. Just trees. Just shadows. I got in, locked the doors, started the engine. My headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the trailhead. Empty. I didn't stay to think. I put the car in reverse, turned around, and got the hell out of there. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, until I saw streetlights, until I felt like I was back in the real world. I reported what I found, told the police everything. They went out there the next morning. The body was gone, just like that. No sign of it.
No footprints.
Nothing. But I know what I saw. I never went back to that trail. It was late September when I decided to go on a solo hiking trip. The kind of trip that clears your head, gives you space to think, and lets you disconnect from the constant hum of modern life. I had done plenty of solo hikes before, and I wasn't worried about being alone in the woods. If anything, I preferred it that way.
No distractions. No responsibilities.
Just me, the trees, and the sound of my own footsteps crunching against the dirt. I had picked a trail that wasn't well known but wasn't completely remote either. It was about a 3-hour drive from where I lived, tucked away in the mountains. The hike itself was a loop that stretched for nearly 15 miles, winding through thick forests, rocky inclines, and small clearings that overlooked valleys below. There were a few campsites along the way, and my plan was to complete the trail in 2 days, hike half, set up camp for the night, and finish the loop the next morning. I arrived at the trailhead just after noon. The sky was overcast, the air crisp with the scent of damp earth and pine. I strapped on my pack, checked my gear one last time, and set off. The trail started off easy, just a gentle incline with a well-marked path. I moved at a steady pace, enjoying the solitude. Every so often, I would stop to take in the quiet, letting my mind wander. About 2 hours in, the trail got steeper. The trees grew denser, the air heavier. It was the kind of silence that presses in on you, where even the wind feels like it's holding its breath. I didn't mind. I liked that kind of silence. It made the world feel smaller, more personal. Then I saw her. She was standing on the side of the trail, just ahead of me, partially obscured by the trees. At first, I thought she was just another hiker, maybe someone taking a break or waiting for a companion to catch up. She was wearing a long, dark coat, something heavy, the kind of thing you'd wear in winter rather than early fall. Her posture was stiff, unnatural, like she was standing too straight, too still. I slowed my pace, watching her carefully. She wasn't moving, just standing there, not adjusting her pack, not drinking water, just standing. Something about her made my skin crawl. As I got closer, I could see her more clearly. Her face was pale, her eyes dark. Her hair was long and tangled, hanging in uneven strands over her face. She wasn't looking at me, but she wasn't looking away either. It was like she was staring past me, through me. I debated whether to say something. A quick nod, a polite acknowledgement, but something deep in my gut told me to just keep walking. So I did. I kept my pace steady, moving past her without looking directly at her. I could feel her presence, though, like the weight of a storm cloud pressing down on my shoulders. Once I was a few yards ahead, I glanced back. She was still there, still standing in the same spot, still facing forward. I picked up my pace. For the next hour, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustling leaf, every shifting shadow felt like it was her. I knew it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I kept checking over my shoulder, half expecting to see her following me, but she wasn't there. By the time I reached the halfway point of my hike, the sun was starting to dip behind the mountains. I found a small clearing near a stream and decided it was as good a place as any to set up camp. I went through my usual routine, pitched my tent, gathered some wood for a small fire, and heated up a quick meal. As the night settled in, I tried to push the memory of the woman out of my mind. She was probably just another hiker, maybe someone who had gotten lost or was waiting for someone. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The woods felt different that night. The usual sounds of nocturnal life, the chirping of insects, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush were absent. The silence was too deep, too heavy. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like something was just outside my tent, watching me. A few times, I thought I heard movement, soft footsteps, the crunch of leaves. But when I held my breath and listened, there was nothing. Morning couldn't come fast enough. As soon as the first light crept through the trees, I broke camp and got back on the trail. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that the lack of sleep had messed with my head. I just needed to finish the hike, get back to my car, and put this whole thing behind me. I was about an hour into my hike when I saw her again. She was ahead of me on the trail, standing in the exact same way as before. Stiff, unmoving, her face partially hidden by her hair. My stomach turned to ice. There was no way she could have gotten ahead of me. I had been hiking since dawn, and I hadn't seen another soul on the trail. If she had passed me in the night, I would have heard her. There was no shortcut she could have taken to get ahead of me. She shouldn't be there. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I just kept walking, keeping my eyes locked forward, pretending she wasn't there. As I passed her, I noticed something else. Her clothes, her coat, her boots were damp, covered in mud, as if she had been walking through the forest all night. But her face, her hands, completely clean. I moved faster. I didn't look back this time. I didn't need to. I could feel her eyes on me. The last few miles of the trail were a blur. I pushed myself harder than I ever had, my legs burning, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The only thing that mattered was getting back to my car. By the time I reached the trailhead, my hands were shaking so badly I struggled to unlock my car door. I threw my pack into the back seat, jumped in, and started the engine. My eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. The trail was empty. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I never told anyone what happened. Never wrote about it, never looked up missing persons reports, never went back to that trail. But every now and then, when I'm alone in the woods, I get that feeling again. The feeling of being watched. And I wonder if she's still out there, waiting. It was early September when I decided to go on a solo hiking trip in the mountains. I had been wanting to test myself, to see if I could handle a few days out in the wilderness alone, away from the noise of life. I picked a remote trail in Colorado, a place where I knew I wouldn't run into many people. The idea was to disconnect, to push myself, to get away from everything for a while. The drive to the trailhead took nearly 4 hours, winding through dense forests and steep inclines. The road eventually turned to dirt, and I had to go slow to avoid tearing up my car on the rough terrain. By the time I arrived, the sun was starting to sink lower in the sky. I had planned to get there earlier, but the drive took longer than expected. Still, I wasn't too worried. I had mapped everything out in advance. The first leg of my hike was only about 6 miles to a good camping spot near a small lake. I figured I could make it before full dark if I moved quickly. I strapped on my backpack, adjusted my gear, and started down the trail. The air was crisp, with a slight chill that hinted at the coming fall. The smell of pine needles and damp earth filled my lungs as I made my way deeper into the woods. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the dirt path and the occasional rustling of branches as squirrels darted around above me. The first couple of miles were peaceful. I found myself settling into a rhythm, my breathing steady, my mind clearing. Every so often, I would stop to take in the view. Towering pines stretching up into the sky, the occasional break in the trees revealing distant mountain peaks bathed in golden light. It was everything I had hoped for. About an hour in, I started to feel like something was off. It wasn't anything obvious, just a vague sense that the woods around me had grown too quiet. The usual background noise of birds chirping and insects buzzing had faded. Even the wind, which had been rustling the treetops when I started, had died down. The silence felt heavy, unnatural. I pushed the thought aside and kept walking, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then I started noticing little things. A set of deep scratches on a tree trunk, higher up than any bear or mountain lion would have made. A few broken branches along the trail that didn't look like they had fallen naturally. At one point, I spotted a deer carcass just off the path. It was fresh, the body mostly intact, but the eyes were missing. Something about it made my skin crawl. I had seen dead animals in the wild before, but there was something strange about this one. I picked up my pace, wanting to reach my campsite before dark. The last thing I needed was to be stuck in unfamiliar terrain at night. By the time I made it to the lake, the sun had almost completely set. I quickly set up my tent, started a small fire, and ate a quick meal. The air was colder now, and the wind had picked up again, rustling through the trees around me. As I sat by the fire, I kept getting the feeling that I wasn't alone. I told myself it was just nerves, that my mind was playing tricks on me after seeing that deer. But the feeling wouldn't go away. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the tree line for any signs of movement. Then, just as I was about to turn in for the night, I heard it, a whistle. It came from somewhere deep in the woods, high-pitched and clear. At first, I thought it might have been the wind, but then it came again, a little closer this time. It wasn't a bird or any animal I knew. It sounded human, but there was something wrong with it. It was too perfect, too deliberate, like someone was mimicking a whistle rather than actually whistling. I stood up, my body tense. My eyes scanned the darkness, but I couldn't see anything beyond the glow of the fire. My instincts screamed at me to put the fire out, to get inside the tent, to stay quiet. Instead, I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the trees. Nothing. The whistling stopped. I stood there for what felt like forever, my ears straining for any sound. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. Eventually, I forced myself to sit back down. I kept my knife close, my flashlight within reach. Every so often, I thought I heard something moving in the woods, branches snapping, leaves crunching, but I couldn't be sure. I barely slept that night. Every time I started to drift off, I would hear a faint rustling outside my tent. Once, I thought I saw a shadow pass by the thin fabric, but when I looked out, there was nothing there. Morning couldn't come fast enough. As soon as the first light broke through the trees, I packed up my gear and got moving. I told myself I was just being paranoid, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The second day was worse. The deeper I went into the forest, the more I felt like I was being watched. The trees seemed taller, the shadows darker. The feeling of unease from the previous night hadn't faded. It had grown stronger. Around midday, I came across another dead animal. This time, it was a fox, its body twisted unnaturally, its eyes missing just like the deer. The fur along its back was matted with dried blood, but there were no visible wounds. It looked like it had been dropped there, placed in the middle of the trail. I felt my stomach twist. Something was wrong. I should have turned back. I should have cut my trip short, but I was too stubborn. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I was letting my imagination get the best of me. I kept going. That night, I didn't make a fire. I set up my tent deep in the trees, away from the open, trying to stay hidden. As the sun went down, the forest grew unnervingly quiet again. Then, just as before, the whistling started. This time, it was closer. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. My knife was gripped tightly in my hand. Then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, not an animal, something walking on two legs. They circled my tent. Once, twice, I didn't move. Then, right outside my tent, I heard a voice. Sounded like my own. It whispered my name. I don't remember much after that. I must have passed out from fear because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The sun was shining through the trees. My body was shaking. I forced myself to pack up and started moving as fast as I could. I didn't stop. I hiked for hours, pushing myself beyond exhaustion. I didn't eat. I didn't rest. I just kept moving. By the time I reached my car, my legs were nearly giving out. I threw my gear inside, locked the doors, and sped down the dirt road, not stopping until I was miles away from that place. I don't know what was out there. I don't want to know. All I know is that I will never go hiking alone again. I was deep in the Amazon, far from any place that could be called civilization. The heat pressed down on me, thick and wet, the kind that clung to your skin and made it impossible to stay dry. Every breath felt heavy. My backpack, stuffed with supplies, weighed on my shoulders, and each step forward felt harder than the last. The jungle was alive with sound. Birds, insects, and unseen creatures shifting in the undergrowth. I had spent weeks preparing for this hike, mapping out the route, packing supplies, studying survival techniques. I thought I was ready. I wasn't. The plan was to hike for a few days, cutting through a lesser-traveled section of the rainforest, then circle back to my starting point. I had a GPS, a map, and a compass. My water filter would keep me hydrated, and I had enough food to last. I felt confident when I set out. The first day passed without trouble. I moved carefully, keeping track of my location, checking the map often. I set up camp before nightfall, strung up my hammock, and listened to the rainforest hum around me. Sleep didn't come easy. The sounds of the jungle never stopped, and every crack of a branch or rustle in the leaves made me open my eyes, scanning the darkness. The second day, I pressed deeper into the forest. The terrain was rougher here, the ground uneven, the trees growing so thick that they blocked out the sky. I had to use my machete to clear a path at times. Sweat soaked through my clothes. The air felt heavier, almost suffocating. I made good progress, though, and by mid-afternoon I reached a small river. I took a break, filled my water bottle, and rested in the shade. That's when I noticed something off. The jungle never went completely silent, but there was a shift in the noise. The usual sounds, chirping birds, buzzing insects, had faded. It was subtle at first, but soon I realized it wasn't just my imagination. Something had changed. I looked around, scanning the trees, the undergrowth. Nothing seemed different, but my instincts told me otherwise. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I forced myself to ignore it and kept moving. I told myself it was paranoia, that the jungle played tricks on people who weren't used to its ways. Still, I found myself checking over my shoulder more often, my hand resting on the handle of my machete. As the sun lowered, I picked a spot to set up camp, near another stream. I made a small fire, just enough for warmth and to keep insects away. The feeling of being watched never left. Sleep was impossible. I lay in my hammock, staring into the darkness, listening. The jungle noises had returned, but I couldn't relax. I kept my machete within reach. Somewhere deep in the night, I heard something, a branch snapping, not from an animal. It was slow, deliberate. I held my breath. Another step, then another. Something or someone was moving in the trees, just beyond the glow of my fire. I stayed completely still. The steps stopped. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears. Minutes passed. Then, slowly, the sounds of the jungle filled the silence again. I didn't move for a long time. When morning came, I packed quickly. I hadn't seen anything, but I knew I wasn't alone out here. My plan had been to keep hiking, but now all I wanted was to get back. I checked my map and GPS, reoriented myself, and started heading toward my starting point. I moved fast, faster than I should have. The heat, the humidity, and the weight of my pack made it harder, but I pushed on. Midway through the day, I noticed something strange. A tree with deep marks in the bark, knife marks. Not old, fresh. I kept moving. An hour later, another tree. More marks. Then a piece of cloth caught on a branch. Dark colored, worn. I wasn't imagining things. Someone had been here recently, and they wanted me to know. Panic started creeping in, but I forced myself to stay calm. I had a machete, a knife, and a small emergency flare gun. If I needed to, I could defend myself. But against who or what? I picked up the pace, my eyes scanning the jungle constantly. Then I saw it. A footprint, not mine, deep in the mud, fresh, barefoot. I wasn't just being watched. Someone was following me. I kept moving, my pulse hammering. I needed to get out of this part of the jungle before nightfall. I pushed through branches, my legs aching, sweat stinging my eyes. Then, up ahead, something hung from a low tree branch. Piece of my own gear, my spare bandana. I had packed it in my bag that morning. Someone had gone through my things. My mouth went dry. I didn't stop to think. I started running. Branches whipped against my face. My pack bounced against my back. I didn't know if I was running in the right direction anymore. I just ran. Something moved to my left, fast, then to my right. I wasn't alone. My lungs burned, but I didn't stop. The ground sloped downward suddenly, and I lost my footing. I tumbled forward, crashing through vines and brush, landing hard on my side. Pain shot through my ribs. I struggled to get up, gasping, my vision swimming. Then I saw them, a figure standing just at the edge of the trees. Thin, dirty, barefoot. They didn't move. I scrambled to my feet, my hand on my machete. The figure didn't come closer. They just stood there watching. I backed away, my heart pounding. Then, slowly, they turned and disappeared into the jungle. I didn't wait. I ran. I don't remember how long I kept going. Felt like hours. By the time I saw the river again, my legs were shaking, my breath ragged. I followed the water, knowing it would lead me back. Every step felt like it took all the energy I had left. By the time I reached my starting point, the sun was setting. I stumbled onto the dirt road where my ride was supposed to pick me up. I collapsed onto my knees. I didn't look back. I never told anyone what happened. I didn't report it. I didn't go back. I still don't know who or what was out there, and I don't want to. I didn't think twice when my team suggested a hiking trip. It had been a stressful couple of months at work, and everyone needed a break. A weekend in the wild, away from deadlines and screens, sounded perfect. We had done smaller hikes before, but this was going to be the longest one yet. A 3-day trek through a remote gorge, surrounded by dense forests, steep cliffs, and rivers that cut through the landscape like deep scars. The group was solid. We all worked together, knew each other well, and had been on plenty of outdoor trips before. There were 6 of us, all fairly experienced. We had the gear, the maps, and enough supplies to last. The plan was simple: hike down into the gorge, follow the river for a day, then climb back up on the other side. We would camp 2 nights before looping back to the trailhead where our cars were parked. The first day was uneventful. The descent was tough but manageable. The trail was steep, the kind where every step sent loose dirt and small rocks tumbling down. We kept a steady pace, stopping only to adjust packs or drink water. By late afternoon, we reached the riverbed, setting up camp in a small clearing near the water. The air was cool, the sound of rushing water constant. By the second day, things started feeling off. The plan was to follow the river deeper into the gorge, but the terrain was rougher than we expected. The rocks were slick, and the water level was higher than it should have been for that time of year. At some points, we had to wade through the shallows, boots sinking into the soft riverbed. It slowed us down more than we had planned, and by midday we realized we weren't making good time. Then we found the boot. It was half buried in mud near the edge of the river, torn and waterlogged. Just one with no sign of the other. The tread was nearly worn smooth, but it had been a good brand once, the kind meant for long treks. We looked around, but there was nothing else. No backpack, no gear, no sign of anyone nearby. It didn't make sense. The area wasn't a well-known hiking spot, and there had been no reports of missing people. We joked about it at first, but it lingered in the back of my mind. By late afternoon, we were still behind schedule. The sun was starting to sink behind the cliffs, throwing long shadows across the river. The gorge felt deeper than before, like the walls had closed in tighter. The air smelled different, damp, but with something else underneath, something stale. Felt like we weren't supposed to be there. Then we found the second boot. It was a few hundred meters ahead, wedged between 2 rocks. Same brand, same worn-down tread. It hadn't been there long. The leather was damp but not rotted. It was as if someone had walked through the river barefoot, leaving behind only their boots. We didn't stop to think about it too much. We needed to find a campsite before dark, and the gorge wasn't the kind of place you wanted to navigate at night. We pushed on, eventually finding a flat, dry area a little higher up from the riverbed. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. That night, I barely slept. There was movement in the trees. Not the kind made by wind, but something heavier, slower. Footsteps. A few times, I sat up, straining to hear over the sound of the river. But each time I thought I had pinpointed it, it stopped. By the 3rd morning, everyone was on edge. We packed up quickly, eager to finish the loop and get out. The plan was simple: climb up the other side of the gorge and reconnect with the main trail. It should have taken half a day, but the trail was gone. The map showed a clear path leading up the side of the gorge, marked by a series of switchbacks. But when we reached the spot, there was nothing. No markers, no signs of a path, just a steep wall of rock and thick underbrush. It was as if the trail had never existed. We tried to find another route. We hiked upstream, searching for any sign of a path leading up. Nothing. We doubled back, thinking we had missed something. Still nothing. The gorge was deep, and the cliffs were too steep to climb without proper gear. Then we heard it. A sound, faint at first, carried by the wind. Took a moment to register. It was whistling, a low, slow tune, drifting through the trees. We froze. It was coming from the direction we had just come. The river, the campsite. Then it stopped. No one said a word. No one needed to. We turned and kept moving, faster this time. We needed to get out. For hours we hiked. The map was useless now, but we had compasses. We followed the direction we knew the main trail had to be, cutting through thick underbrush, pushing forward even when our legs ached. Then the whistling started again. Closer this time. I didn't turn around. None of us did. We walked until the trees thinned out, until the steep cliffs turned to sloping hills, until the underbrush became familiar again. Then we saw the sign, a wooden post, weathered and worn, marking the entrance to the main trail. The cars were a few miles ahead. We didn't stop to rest. We didn't talk. We just walked, faster than before, like something was still behind us. By the time we reached the cars, the sun was setting. We tossed our gear in the trunks, got in and drove. No one spoke on the way back. We never found out who was out there. We never figured out where the boots came from or what happened to the trail that was supposed to lead us out. We never went back. I had planned this trip for weeks. The Peak District had always been on my list, and with a free weekend ahead, I packed my rucksack with enough supplies to last me 2 days. I had my tent, sleeping bag, extra layers, a portable stove, and enough food to keep me going. I wasn't new to hiking, but I wasn't an expert either. I had done a fair share of overnight hikes, but nothing too extreme. The plan was simple: start early, follow the mapped route, and camp for the night before heading back the next day. The forecast showed rain, but nothing too serious. I had waterproofs and a good pair of boots, so I wasn't too worried. I arrived at the small car park early in the morning. The sky was gray, the air damp from a night of light rain. My boots crunched against the gravel as I locked the car and adjusted my pack. The first part of the hike was easy, wide trails, well-marked paths, and the occasional other hiker. But as the hours passed, the landscape changed. The path narrowed, the trees grew denser, and the signs of civilization faded. I didn't mind. In fact, I enjoyed it. I liked the solitude, the way the world felt quieter the deeper I went. The only sounds were my footsteps, the rustling of the wind through the trees, and the distant calls of birds. By midday, I reached a clearing where I had planned to rest and eat. A small stream ran through the middle, and I refilled my bottle before sitting down on a fallen tree. I checked my map, making sure I was still on track. Everything was going as planned. It was only after I packed up and started moving again that I noticed something strange. The ground had changed. The muddy path was torn up, like something heavy had moved through it recently. Not just footsteps. These were deep, uneven gouges in the earth, as if something had been dragged. I frowned and looked around, but there was nothing in sight. The forest was quiet, still, except for the occasional sway of branches in the wind. I kept moving. The deeper I went, the more uneasy I felt. I told myself it was just my imagination. I was alone, in the middle of the woods, miles from any real civilization. Of course, my brain would start playing tricks on me, but no matter how much I tried to ignore it, the feeling wouldn't go away. The trees seemed closer together. The path felt narrower. Every now and then, I would hear a sound, something moving in the undergrowth. A rustle, a snap of a twig. I would stop, listen, and hear nothing. Just the wind. I checked my map again. I was still on track, still heading in the right direction. But the further I went, the more wrong it felt. The landscape didn't match what was on the map anymore. The incline was steeper than it should have been, the trees more overgrown. Then I saw it, a piece of fabric caught on a branch. Dark blue, torn, damp from the rain. It looked like part of a jacket. I reached out, hesitating before pulling it free. It was stiff, like it had been there a while. My stomach twisted. Someone else had been here. I glanced around. The forest was still. The sky was getting darker, not just from the thickening clouds, but from the time of day. I needed to find a place to camp soon. I moved on, walking faster than before. The feeling of being watched was growing stronger. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks. But every time I looked back, I felt sure I would see something standing among the trees. I didn't stop until I found a small clearing. It wasn't ideal, uneven ground, damp soil, but I was too tired to care. I set up my tent quickly, trying to ignore the unease crawling up my spine. I forced myself to eat. Every bite felt heavy in my mouth. The sounds of the forest were different now, less alive. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. Night fell. I climbed into my sleeping bag, zipped up the tent, and tried to sleep. I woke up to a sound outside, a slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps on damp earth. I held my breath. The sound stopped. I listened. The wind had died. The trees were still. Then another step. I swallowed hard, trying to stay calm. Could be an animal, a fox, a deer, something harmless. Then something pressed against the side of my tent. A hand. I could see the faint outline through the thin fabric. Fingers splayed, pressing just hard enough to make the material stretch. I didn't move. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would give me away. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the hand slid away. Silence. I lay there, frozen. Minutes passed. Then an hour. I didn't sleep. I just lay there listening, waiting. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I was already packing. I moved fast, stuffing my gear into my bag without caring about neatness. I started hiking back the way I came. Fast. Too fast. My legs ached. My body was tired, but I didn't stop. I needed to get back to my car. I checked my map constantly, making sure I was on track. Every time I looked up, I expected to see something in the trees, something watching me. I was about an hour from the car when I found the footprints. Fresh, deep, large, not mine. They led in the direction I was heading. I kept moving, faster now. I didn't stop until I saw my car. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking as I unlocked the door. The second I was inside, I locked it, started the engine, and drove. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was miles away. I don't know what I saw in those woods. I don't know who was out there with me, but I do know one thing: something wasn't right, and I won't be hiking alone again. I've always liked hiking alone. Not in a reckless way, not in some romanticized survivalist way, but in a way that makes sense to me. It clears my head, helps me think, and lets me enjoy a world that feels quieter than the one we live in every day. I don't go too deep into the wilderness, never too far from a marked trail, and always keep the essentials in my pack. Plenty of water, food, a knife, a first aid kit, and even a small emergency beacon just in case. But I've never had to use it. That was until the hike that changed everything for me. It was early October, just cool enough to be comfortable, and I had taken a few days off work to clear my head. I drove out to a trail I had only hiked once before, years ago. It was a long one, stretching miles into thick woods with an old, abandoned fire lookout at the peak. I planned to reach the top by mid-afternoon, rest there for a bit, and then hike back down before dark. I parked my car at the nearly empty lot, just one other vehicle there. A rusty old truck that looked like it hadn't been moved in weeks. I didn't think much of it. People sometimes left their cars for multi-day hikes, and the lot wasn't monitored. The first few miles were easy. A well-worn dirt path cut through towering pine trees, patches of golden leaves scattered along the ground. I kept a steady pace, enjoying the solitude, the sound of birds, and the occasional rustling in the underbrush from small animals. But around the third mile, I noticed something. Footprints. At first, it didn't bother me. It was a popular trail after all. But the more I walked, the more I noticed something strange about them. They weren't fresh, but they also weren't old enough to have been left days ago. More than that, they didn't match normal hiking boots. Most hiking shoes leave a distinct pattern, but these prints were off. The sole was smooth, no tread at all, almost like someone had been walking in worn-out sneakers or even barefoot. And they weren't spaced like someone moving at a normal pace. Some were close together, others were farther apart, like whoever left them had been staggering or stopping every few steps. I pushed the thought out of my mind and kept going. About an hour later, I reached the first major clearing, a wide, flat area with a few fallen logs where hikers could rest. I stopped for a quick drink and a granola bar, looking around. It was quiet, almost too quiet. Something felt off. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I was being watched. It wasn't paranoia. It was that deep, gut-level instinct that something isn't right. I scanned the trees, the ridgeline, the trail behind me. Nothing. I told myself it was just my imagination and kept going. By mile 5, I saw the first real sign that something was wrong. A campsite, not an official one, just an old, ragged sleeping bag shoved between two trees. A plastic grocery bag filled with trash, empty cans, a crumpled water bottle, a few food wrappers. It didn't look abandoned, but it also didn't look well kept. Someone had been here recently, maybe even last night. I stood there for a moment, feeling uneasy. It wasn't illegal to camp off-trail, but something about it felt wrong. No fire pit, no tent, no sign that someone was actually living there. Just a single sleeping bag and trash left behind like whoever was there had left in a hurry. I kept moving. Not long after, I saw him. At first, he was just a shape in the trees, a dark figure standing off the trail about 50 yards ahead. I stopped immediately, my heart hammering in my chest. He wasn't hiking. He wasn't even moving, just standing there, partially hidden behind a tree. I could see his clothes, dark pants, a dirty jacket, long hair hanging over his face. He wasn't carrying a backpack or any gear, just standing, watching. I forced myself to breathe and kept walking. I didn't speed up, didn't let myself act like I noticed him. I just kept moving. As I passed, I glanced in his direction. He was closer than I thought. Not 50 yards, maybe 30. His face was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes were locked on me. Not looking past me, not at the trail at me. I kept walking. For the next mile, I fought the urge to look over my shoulder. Every instinct in my body screamed that I was being followed. I didn't hear footsteps, but I felt it. That same gut instinct, that same deep-rooted fear that something wasn't right. Then I saw them, more footprints, the same ones from earlier. Only now they were on top of my own. Whoever he was, he had followed me. I felt my hands shaking. My mind raced. Should I turn back? Should I keep going? The fire lookout wasn't far now. Maybe 2 more miles. I decided to push forward. I picked up my pace, moving faster but not running. Running would make me look weak. Running would mean I was prey. By the time I reached the final stretch, I was drenched in sweat despite the cool air. My legs ached, but I pushed through. Then I saw the tower, a rusty, metal structure standing tall against the treetops. The old fire lookout, the last safe place before the long trek back down. I sprinted the last 100 yards, taking the steps 2 at a time, my heart pounding. When I reached the top, I turned and looked down. He was there, standing at the base of the tower, looking up at me. I pulled out my phone, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. No service. I wasn't surprised. I checked my backpack. My knife was there. My emergency beacon was there. I pressed the beacon, a last resort. It would send my coordinates to local search and rescue, but I had no idea how long it would take. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I stayed at the top, my eyes locked on him. He never moved, just stood there, watching. Then, as the sun started to dip below the trees, he turned and walked back into the woods. I didn't leave until I saw search and rescue's helicopter in the distance. When they found me, I told them what happened. They searched the area but found nothing. No footprints, no sleeping bag, no sign that anyone had been there at all. But I know what I saw. I never hiked alone again. I always liked hiking alone. It gave me space to think, to be away from people, to let the silence of nature settle into my bones. The more remote the trail, the better. I never felt uneasy out there, even when the woods stretched for miles without a single sign of another person. It felt like the only place I could breathe. That's why I had no hesitation when I decided to spend a few days hiking in a national forest I hadn't visited before. It was late autumn, right before the cold really set in, and I figured it would be the perfect time. No crowds, no noise, just me and the wilderness. I had done my research, studied the maps, packed my gear carefully. I wasn't careless. I brought enough food for 4 days, a water filter, extra clothes, a tent, a knife, a lighter, all the essentials. The trail I chose was barely marked, one of those old paths that didn't get much foot traffic anymore. It wound up through thick forest, climbed high into the hills, and eventually followed along a deep, narrow valley before looping back. I parked my truck at a small gravel lot where the trailhead began. No other cars were there, which didn't surprise me. The place was too out of the way for casual hikers. I locked up, slung my pack over my shoulders, and started walking. The air was cool, the sky overcast, and everything smelled like damp earth and pine needles. For the first few hours, everything was perfect. The trail was rough but easy enough to follow. Fallen leaves muffled my footsteps, and the woods pressed in close, making it feel like I was the only person left in the world. Somewhere around mid-afternoon, I noticed the woods had gone completely silent. I don't mean just quiet, I mean silent. No wind, no birds, no rustling in the underbrush. It was like something had pressed pause on the whole forest. I stopped walking, listening. Nothing. I had been in the woods enough to know that kind of silence wasn't normal. Usually, even on the stillest days, you'd hear something. The chirp of a bird, the snap of a twig, the hum of insects. But there was nothing. Just a heavy, unnatural stillness. I brushed it off and kept walking. Maybe I had spooked something. Maybe a predator was nearby. I kept an eye out, my hand resting near the knife strapped to my belt. But I didn't see anything, and after a while, the normal sounds of the forest returned. By the time I set up camp that evening, I had mostly forgotten about it. I picked a spot near a rocky outcrop, far enough from the trail that I wouldn't be easily seen. I cooked a quick meal, stretched out in my tent, and listened to the wind move through the trees. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. My heart was pounding and I had that feeling, you know, the one where something isn't right. I listened. There it was. A sound just outside my tent. A slow, shuffling step. Not an animal. Not the quick, light movement of a deer or the scurrying of a raccoon. This was something big. Something that walked on two legs. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight. Then I heard breathing. Low, raspy, uneven. Right outside the thin nylon of my tent. I stayed completely still. The breathing went on for what felt like forever. Slow, deliberate inhales, like whoever or whatever was out there was listening. Then, in the same slow, dragging way, it started to move. A few steps, stopping. A few more steps. Then nothing. I stayed awake for hours, barely breathing, knife in my hand, waiting for whatever it was to come back. But it didn't. When the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. There were footprints in the dirt. Not boots, not bare feet, something in between. Long, almost human, but the toes were too stretched, too clawed. I packed up my gear and moved on. I wasn't about to turn back yet. I had spent too much time planning this trip, and I told myself it was probably some trick of the light, some weird coincidence. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe it was a bear, though I knew the prints weren't from any bear I had ever seen. The second day passed quietly. I hiked deeper into the hills, the trees growing denser, the trail harder to follow. That sense of being watched never fully left me, but I pushed through it. By the time I made camp that night, I had convinced myself I was just being paranoid. Then, just like before, I woke up to the sound of something moving outside my tent. This time, it was worse. It wasn't just one set of footsteps. There were two, one on each side of my tent, moving in slow, deliberate circles. I gripped my knife so hard my hand ached. My breath was shallow, barely there. Then a voice, low, garbled, almost human, but wrong. Hello. I didn't answer. Another voice from the other side. Come out. Something pressed against the tent wall. A handprint, but the fingers were too long. The shape was all wrong. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The voices laughed. Low, almost wheezing. Then, just as slow as they had come, they moved away. I waited until sunrise before stepping outside. The prints were there again, bigger this time, more of them, circling my tent in the dirt. I packed up and started hiking back the way I had come. I didn't stop, didn't eat, just walked, fast and steady, heart hammering in my chest. The silence followed me. The feeling of being watched never left. I didn't see anything else. Not until I reached the last stretch of trail, where the trees thinned and I could see my truck. That's when I saw it, standing at the tree line, watching, tall, too tall, limbs too thin, eyes black, hollow, staring. Its mouth moved, but no sound came out. Then, just as I blinked, it was gone. I ran to my truck, threw my pack inside, and peeled out of there so fast my tires spun gravel. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I never went back, and I never hiked alone again. I have always liked hiking alone. There's something about being away from everything, where the only sounds are the wind, the rustling trees, and my own footsteps. Clears my head, makes me feel small in a way that I like. I've done a lot of solo hikes, some in places I probably shouldn't have gone alone, but I've always been careful, checking maps, tracking my route, bringing enough supplies. This trip was no different, or at least it wasn't supposed to be. The plan was simple, a 3-day hike through a remote mountain range, following an old logging trail. I'd researched it well. The route wasn't popular, but it was on maps, with some old forest roads running nearby in case I needed an exit. I packed enough food, a good sleeping bag, extra layers for the cold nights. Everything should have been fine. I started early, driving out to the trailhead just after dawn. The air was cool, damp from the night before, with mist still hanging low in the valleys. The trees were thick, towering pines stretching high above me, their trunks disappearing into the fog. The trail was barely a trail at all, more of a narrow, overgrown path winding up into the hills. For the first few hours, I made good progress. The ground was rough, uneven in places, but nothing I couldn't handle. I saw no signs of other hikers. No footprints, no campfire remains. It was just me out there, which was exactly what I wanted. By midday, the fog had burned off, and I got my first clear view from the ridge. The land stretched out below, a sea of trees, nothing but wilderness in every direction. No houses, no roads, no signs of people. Just the mountains rolling out one after another. Felt good. I kept moving, pacing myself, making sure not to overdo it. The climb was steeper than I expected, the ground looser in places. A few times, I had to use my hands to scramble up the rocks, my boots slipping on damp moss. I kept an eye on my GPS, making sure I was still on track. It was slow going, but I wasn't worried. By late afternoon, I reached a high ridge, a narrow spine of rock cutting through the trees. The trail was even fainter here, barely visible at times. I had to stop more often, checking my map, making sure I wasn't drifting off course. The sun was getting low, casting long shadows across the hills. I needed to find a place to camp before dark. I spotted a small clearing just off the ridge, a flat patch of ground tucked between some boulders. It wasn't perfect, but it would do. I set up my tent, ate a quick meal, and watched the last light fade from the sky. The air was getting colder, the wind picking up. I crawled into my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of the forest, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves. I should have slept well. I was tired, my muscles aching from the climb, but something kept me awake. Maybe it was the wind shifting through the trees. Maybe it was just my mind, restless from being out here alone. Either way, I lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling of my tent, waiting for sleep to come. Eventually, I must have dozed off. When I woke up, it was still dark. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. The wind had died down, and the forest was quiet. Too quiet. No night sounds, no rustling branches, nothing. Just silence. I listened, holding my breath. Then I heard it. A sound in the distance, faint but distinct. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving through the trees, coming from the ridge above me. I froze. I wasn't near any major trails. No one else should be out here. And yet, the footsteps continued, steady, unhurried, as if someone was carefully picking their way through the brush. I reached for my flashlight but stopped myself. If someone was out there, I didn't want to give away my position. I stayed still, listening, heart pounding. The footsteps grew closer, not fast, not running, just moving. Then they stopped, right outside my tent. I held my breath, every muscle tense. The fabric of my tent was thin, but I couldn't see out. I could only listen. The silence stretched. Then, slowly, the footsteps moved again, circling my tent. Not an animal, not a deer or a bear. The steps were too precise, too controlled. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. I stayed still, barely breathing. After what felt like forever, the steps moved away, back up toward the ridge. I waited, listening, straining to hear any sign of movement. But there was nothing. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Finally, I let out a slow, shaky breath. I didn't sleep again. At first light, I packed up quickly, forcing my stiff, cold hands to move. I needed to get out of there. I didn't know who was out there with me, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I checked my GPS. I could take a different route, cut down toward an old logging road that should lead back to the main trail. It would be longer, but it would get me out of here faster. I started walking, moving fast but careful. My legs were sore, my body running on adrenaline. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me, but there was no one. By midday, I reached the logging road. It was barely more than a dirt track, overgrown in places, but it was a path. I followed it, moving downhill, pushing myself harder than I should have. I just wanted to be gone. Then, just as the road curved toward the valley, I saw them. Footprints, fresh in the mud. Not mine. Someone else had been here, and they were heading in the same direction I was going. I don't think I've ever felt fear like that before. I turned, stepping off the road, into the trees. I moved carefully, staying low, watching the road from a distance. If someone was ahead, I didn't want them to know I was coming. I followed the road from the cover of the trees, moving parallel to it. My heart was hammering. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made me flinch. Then I saw it. Just ahead, where the road dipped into a hollow, there was a figure, standing still, not walking, not moving, just standing. I couldn't see details from this distance, only the shape of a person, facing the road, head tilted slightly, as if listening. I stayed low, barely breathing. Then, without warning, the figure moved, stepping back into the trees, vanishing into the brush. I waited, my body frozen, listening. Nothing. The road was clear again. I didn't move for a long time. When I finally did, I took a different path, cutting through the forest, avoiding the road completely. It was harder, slower, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. By late afternoon, I reached my car. I don't even remember the last mile. I just remember the relief, the shaking in my hands as I unlocked the door, the way my breath came in ragged gasps. I drove without stopping all the way home. I still don't know who was out there. I don't think I ever want to, but I haven't hiked alone since. I had planned the hike for months. The idea had come to me after spending too much time in the city, surrounded by noise, traffic, and too many people packed into too little space. I needed time away, time alone. France had always been a place I wanted to explore outside of its cities, and the forests in the south seemed perfect. The Pyrenees were too rugged for the kind of hiking I wanted, and the Alps felt too well-traveled. But the thick, sprawling forests in the central region, stretching out between small, old villages, seemed like the right kind of solitude. I arrived in a small town early in the morning. It was one of those places where old stone buildings lined narrow streets, and everything looked like it had been standing for a few hundred years. The plan was to hike a remote trail that cut deep through the forest, leading to an abandoned hunting lodge. It wasn't a well-known spot, which was why it interested me. From what I had read online, it was built in the early 1900s but had been left to rot decades ago. The trail wasn't marked on most modern maps, but an old forum post described how to find it. The post was almost 10 years old, but I figured the directions wouldn't have changed much. I packed enough supplies for a 2-day hike. My backpack held food, a sleeping bag, a knife, and a flashlight with extra batteries. I carried a small tent in case the lodge wasn't in good enough shape to sleep in. The trail started off easy, a well-worn dirt path winding through the trees, birds chirping overhead, sunlight filtering through the leaves. Felt peaceful, exactly what I had wanted. As I walked, the trail gradually became less defined. The dirt path thinned out, and after a few hours, I realized I hadn't seen any trail markers for a while. I double-checked my notes. According to the old post, I needed to find a dry riverbed and follow it until I reached a ridge. From there, the lodge was supposed to be a short walk downhill. Finding the riverbed wasn't difficult. The land dipped, and a wide stretch of smooth, pale stones cut through the forest. There was no water, just a narrow trickle running between the rocks. I followed it, keeping my pace steady, checking my surroundings every so often to make sure I wasn't veering off course. The first sign that something was off came about an hour later. I noticed an old, rotting backpack sitting among the rocks. It was covered in moss, torn open, the fabric stiff with age. I stopped and looked at it. There was no way to tell how long it had been there, but it looked like it had been abandoned for years. The straps were broken, the zippers rusted. I didn't touch it. I had seen enough stories about lost hikers to know that finding abandoned gear in the middle of nowhere was never a good sign. I kept moving. The ridge came into view, just as the directions had said it would. From there, I was supposed to head downhill to find the lodge. I scanned the area, trying to spot any sign of a trail. There wasn't one. The ground sloped steeply downward, covered in thick underbrush and loose dirt. The trees grew closer together here, their branches weaving into a dense canopy that blocked out most of the light. I hesitated. If the lodge was still down there, it wouldn't be an easy walk. But I had come this far. I took a deep breath and started my descent. Going downhill was harder than I expected. The ground was unstable, shifting under my weight. Roots snaked through the dirt, and more than once, I had to grab onto tree trunks to keep from slipping. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the bottom. The air was different here, still heavy, the kind of silence that felt unnatural. And then I saw the lodge. It was in worse shape than I had imagined. The roof had partially caved in, and the walls were dark with rot. The windows were nothing but empty holes, jagged shards of glass still clinging to the frames. The wooden porch sagged, the railing broken in places. I approached slowly, my footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dead leaves covering the ground. The door hung open, barely attached to its hinges. I stepped inside. The interior was just as bad as the outside. The floor was warped, some of the boards cracked and splintered. A long wooden table sat in the center of the room, covered in dust and debris. Old chairs lay scattered, some broken, others missing legs. There was an old fireplace against the far wall, its stone surface blackened with soot. I walked further in, my flashlight casting long shadows. The air smelled of damp wood and decay. I checked the back of the lodge, where a small doorway led to what might have been a bedroom. Inside, there was an old mattress, its fabric torn open, stuffing spilling out. A rusted metal frame leaned against the wall. The whole place felt wrong, like it had been abandoned in a hurry. I decided I wasn't staying. The tent would be better. I turned to leave, and that's when I saw them. Footprints, fresh ones. They were imprinted in the dust on the wooden floor, leading from the doorway I had just walked through to the back of the lodge. They weren't mine. The size, the shape, someone else had been here, and it wasn't long ago. I felt a cold weight settle in my stomach. My first thought was that maybe someone else had the same idea coming to explore. But if that were the case, where were they? I had seen no sign of life, no sound of movement. The silence felt suffocating. I slowly backed out of the room, my eyes scanning every corner. The footprints led toward the doorway, but they didn't lead back out. Whoever made them hadn't left through the same way they came in. I stepped outside, my breath coming in shallow bursts. The forest around me was still and dark. My tent was still in my pack, but there was no way I was setting it up near the lodge. I needed to get away from there. I moved quickly, scrambling back up the hill, my legs burning with the effort. Every few steps, I glanced over my shoulder. I saw nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I reached the top, my heart pounding. The sky had darkened, the sun dipping below the trees. I hadn't planned to hike back at night, but there was no chance I was staying out here any longer than I had to. I started back toward the dry riverbed. The trip back felt longer. Every sound in the forest made me flinch. The wind rustled the branches above, but beneath that, I swore I heard something else. Faint, deliberate footsteps, always just out of sync with mine. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. By the time I reached the edge of the forest, my legs felt like they were going to give out. The small town was still a few miles away, but I didn't slow down. I didn't stop until I saw streetlights. I never found out who left those footprints. I never found out if they had been watching me from the lodge, or if they had been waiting for me to fall asleep. But I do know one thing. I wasn't alone out there.